Hey everyone, welcome to Ricktopus. I hope you're all doing well. Today I want to argue that Rick Sanchez is not the cool, detached genius that internet culture has turned him into. He is a deeply traumatized man whose entire personality, from his alcoholism to his God complex to his obsession with control, is a direct psychological response to the murder of his wife Diane. Every mask he wears, every relationship he sabotages, every invention he builds, and every dimension he escapes to is not the behavior of someone who doesn't care. It's the behavior of someone who cares so much that he has spent decades constructing an entire lifestyle around making sure he never has to feel that kind of loss again. And what makes his story one of the most honest depictions of trauma in modern animation is that the show doesn't let him get away with it. It slowly, painfully, and brilliantly forces the smartest man in the universe to confront the one problem his intelligence was never designed to solve: himself. But before we get into all of that, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free, and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. The origin of a broken man. How Diane's death created Rick C137. To understand Rick Sanchez, you have to understand what happened to him before the show even started. Because the Rick we meet in the very first episode, the drunk, angry, reckless genius who drags his grandson out of bed in the middle of the night, that version of Rick didn't always exist. There was a time, believe it or not, when Rick C137 was a completely different person. He was a husband, he was a father, he was a man who was genuinely happy. And the story of how that man became the one we know is probably one of the most tragic backstories in the entire history of adult animation. Now, the show didn't give us this backstory all at once. It took years. Bits and pieces came out slowly across multiple seasons, and for a long time, fans weren't even sure if any of it was real. That's because the first time we saw anything about Rick's past was in the Season 3 premiere, The Rick Shank Rickdemption. In that episode, Rick is locked up in a Galactic Federation prison, and they hack into his brain to try and steal the secret of how he invented interdimensional travel. What they find is a memory. In that memory, we see a younger Rick living in a simple house with his wife Diane and their young daughter, Beth. He's working on some kind of science project in the garage, and he seems content. He seems settled. He seems like a normal guy with a normal family who happens to be incredibly smart. Then another Rick shows up. This other Rick, who we would later come to know as Rick Prime, steps through a portal and offers our Rick the secret to interdimensional travel. He basically says, "Hey, come with me. There's a whole multiverse out there. Why would you stay here?" And our Rick C137, says no. He turns it down. He looks at his wife and daughter and chooses them. He even says he's going to quit science. He wants to stay with his family. But Rick Prime doesn't take the rejection well. Shortly after Rick C137 refuses his offer, a bomb comes flying through a portal and lands right in the family garage. It explodes. And just like that, Diane and Beth are gone. Both of them. Killed instantly, right in front of Rick. His wife and his daughter, taken from him in a single moment by a version of himself who was insulted that Rick thought he was better than him. That's the event that changes everything. That one moment is the reason Rick Sanchez becomes Rick Sanchez. Now, when this memory first appeared in the Rick Shank Rickdemption, Rick immediately told everyone it was fake. He said he made up the whole thing to trick his interrogator into uploading a virus, which allowed him to escape the prison and hijack a body. And for a long time, that's where the conversation stopped. Fans debated endlessly about whether any of that memory was real. Was Diane real? Was the bomb real? Was any of it true? Or was it all just another one of Rick's tricks? The show waited years to answer that question. It wasn't until the Season 5 premiere, Mort Dinner Rick Andre, that we got our first real confirmation. In that episode, Rick encounters Mr. Nimbus, an old rival who clearly knows things about Rick's past. At one point, Nimbus starts talking about Diane, and Rick snaps at him. He says, "Don't establish canonical backstory with me." That line was the show's way of telling the audience, yes, Diane was real. She existed. She was Rick's wife. Whatever else might have been fabricated in that prison memory, Diane herself was not. Then in the Season 5 finale, Rick Mirai Jack, we finally got the full picture. Through Evil Morty's actions, the truth about Rick's past was laid bare. We saw that the memory from the Rick Shank Rickdemption wasn't entirely fake after all. The part that was fabricated was Rick immediately inventing portal technology right after the bomb. In reality, there was a gap. Rick grieved, he suffered, and then, driven by rage and heartbreak, he figured out how to build a portal gun on his own. He became only the second Rick in the entire multiverse to independently invent interdimensional travel. The first was Rick Prime, the one who killed his family. And then Rick C-137 did something that defined the next several decades of his life. He went hunting. Across the multiverse, through dimension after dimension, Rick searched for Rick Prime. He wanted to find the version of himself who murdered Diane and Beth, and he wanted to make him pay for it. But the multiverse is infinite, and finding one specific Rick among countless versions of yourself is nearly impossible. So along the way, Rick killed other Ricks. A lot of other Ricks. He tore through the multiverse like a wrecking ball, leaving a trail of dead, alternate versions of himself behind him, all because he couldn't find the one he was actually looking for. This rampage is what led to the creation of the Citadel of Ricks. The other Ricks across the multiverse got together and essentially surrendered, forming a society of Ricks as a way to stop Rick C-137 from killing them. And here's the twisted part. Rick C-137 didn't just defeat them. He ended up overseeing the construction of the Citadel himself. He became their leader for a time. He even helped create something called the Central Finite Curve, which was basically a wall around the multiverse that only included realities where Rick was the smartest person alive. He built a cage of universes where he could always be on top. All of this, the Citadel, the Central Finite Curve, the decades of violence, all of it came from the grief of losing Diane and Beth. But despite all his power, despite all his intelligence, despite being able to travel anywhere in existence, Rick never found Rick Prime. The one person he wanted more than anything in the multiverse stayed out of his reach. And eventually, Rick gave up. Not on living, but on the search. He stopped looking. And instead, he did something that tells you everything you need to know about his mental state. He flew to Rick Prime's original dimension, the one Prime had abandoned, and he landed in the garage of that dimension's Beth. This Beth had grown up without a father because Rick Prime had left her and Diane 20 years earlier. Rick C-137 stepped into that empty spot. He became the father figure that Rick Prime had walked away from. He started going on adventures with that dimension's Morty. And that is where the show begins. Think about what that means for a second. The Rick we've been watching since episode 1 is not Morty's real grandfather. He's a broken man from another dimension who lost his own family and quietly slid into the life of a family that had been abandoned by a different version of him. Every interaction, every adventure, every moment of connection between Rick and Morty is built on top of that foundation of loss. Rick didn't come back to his family. He found a replacement family because his real one was murdered. And the show kept going deeper. In Solar Ricks, the season 6 premiere, Rick accidentally resets all portal travelers, sending everyone back to their home dimensions. Rick ends up back in dimension C-137, his actual home, the place where Diane and Beth died. And there, he encounters something that he himself created, an AI version of Diane. Rick had built a digital recreation of his dead wife's voice and programmed it to haunt him at his old house. The AI Diane would always sound like she was calling to him from another room, constantly reminding him that he failed to save her, constantly pushing him to get revenge on her killer. Rick programmed his own torture device. He built a machine whose only purpose was to make sure he never moved on, never healed, never forgave himself. When he encounters this AI again in Solar Ricks, Rick actually tells it that he's ready to move on. He says he has a family in another dimension now, and it's time to let go of the past. But even in that moment of attempted growth, the AI Diane ends up being useful. She reasons that if Rick was reset to his home dimension, then Rick Prime was probably reset to his home dimension too. And just like that, the hunt is back on. Rick's attempt to move forward gets pulled right back into the orbit of his trauma. The full horror of what Rick Prime did to Rick wasn't revealed until Unmortricken in Season 7. During their final confrontation, Rick Prime reveals that he didn't just kill Diane in Dimension C-137. He used a weapon called the Omega device to erase every single version of Diane from every single dimension across the entire multiverse. Every Diane, everywhere, in every reality, gone. Wiped from existence. That's why no version of Diane has ever appeared in any of the dimensions Rick and Morty have visited throughout the entire series. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't an oversight. Rick Prime deliberately made sure that Diane could never exist anywhere, ever again. And he didn't stop there. When other Ricks across the multiverse found out what happened to their Dianes and came looking for revenge, Rick Prime built elaborate traps to kill them. He set up death matches where grieving Ricks were forced to fight each other with the false promise that the last one standing would get his Diane back. It was a lie, of course. The surviving Rick would just be killed by a robot wearing Diane's face. Rick Prime turned the grief of an infinite number of Ricks into entertainment for himself. This is the origin of Rick C-137. Not a genius who got bored with normal life, not a mad scientist who chose chaos over stability, a man who had everything taken from him by a crueler version of himself, and who spent the rest of his existence trying to either get revenge or numb the pain of that loss. Every drink he takes, every sarcastic comment he makes, every time he pushes someone away or destroys something beautiful or tells Morty that nothing matters, all of it traces back to a garage, a portal, and a bomb. The really devastating part is that Rick knows this about himself. He's the smartest man in the universe. He can see exactly what happened to him and exactly how it broke him. He understands, on an intellectual level, every single way that Diane's death warped his personality and ruined his ability to connect with people. But understanding a wound and healing from it are two completely different things. And Rick, for most of the series, chooses understanding over healing every single time. He would rather be the smartest person in the room about his own pain than actually do anything about it. That's what makes Rick's story so painful to watch. It's not that he doesn't know he's broken, it's that he knows exactly how broken he is, and he still can't fix it. All the intelligence in the multiverse, all the technology, all the portal guns and spaceship and inventions, none of it can undo what Rick Prime did in that garage. None of it can bring Diane back. And none of it can make Rick stop blaming himself for not being able to protect her. This is the foundation that everything else in Rick's psychology is built on. His drinking, his emotional walls, his need for control, his treatment of his family, his relationship with Morty, his hatred of vulnerability, all of it grows from this one root. Diane's death didn't just take Rick's wife and daughter. It took the version of Rick who could have been happy. It took the version of Rick who believed that love was worth choosing over science. And it left behind the version we know, a man who is constantly running from the one thing he can never outrun, which is himself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But here's the thing about Rick. Even though he buried his pain under layers of sarcasm and science and alcohol, it never actually went away. It just found other ways to come out. And one of the strangest, most heartbreaking ways it surfaces is through a silly little catchphrase that Rick treats like a joke, but that actually means something far darker than anyone around him realizes. Section 2. I am in great pain. Please help me. The mask Rick wears. Rick Sanchez is a lot of things. He's a genius, he's a grandfather, he's an inventor, a fighter, a drunk, and according to most people who spend more than 5 minutes with him, an absolute nightmare to be around. But there's one thing Rick is above everything else, and it's the thing that defines almost every interaction he has with the people in his life. Rick Sanchez is a performer. Every joke, every insult, every belch, every rant about how nothing matters, it's all part of a show. And the audience for that show is everyone around him. Because as long as they're watching the performance, nobody is looking at what's actually underneath it. The clearest example of this comes from something so simple that most people, both in the show and watching it at home, didn't even think twice about it at first. Rick's catchphrase. In Season 1, Episode 5, Me Seeks and Destroy, Rick invents a catchphrase for himself on the spot. After making a joke, he looks straight ahead and yells, "Wubba lubba dub dub!" He says it's like the whooping sound that Arsenio Hall used to do on his talk show, and he announces that this is going to be his new thing. It sounds completely ridiculous. It sounds like the kind of nonsense a drunk old man would shout at a party because he thinks he's funnier than he actually is. And that's exactly how everyone treats it. Morty rolls his eyes, the family ignores it. Rick keeps saying it episode after episode, whenever he's excited or wants to punctuate a moment. Then comes Ricksy Business, the Season 1 finale. Rick throws a massive house party while Beth and Jerry are away. The house is packed with aliens, interdimensional travelers, and all kinds of chaos. Rick is in full party mode, shouting wubba-lubba-dub-dub left and right, having the time of his life. At one point during the party, Morty ends up talking to Bird Person, one of Rick's oldest and closest friends. Bird Person is calm, serious, and clearly someone who knows Rick on a level that nobody else in the family does. Morty mentions Rick's catchphrase, calling it Rick's stupid nonsense catchphrase, and Bird Person stops him. He tells Morty that in the language of his people, the bird people, wubba-lubba-dub-dub has an actual translation. It means, I am in great pain, please help me. Let that sit for a moment. Every single time Rick has shouted that phrase, at parties, during adventures, after making jokes, in moments that looked like pure excitement and celebration, he was saying, I am in great pain, please help me, out loud, to everyone. And nobody understood him. Nobody except Bird Person, who recognized the words for what they were, but also understood that Rick would never accept help, even if someone offered it. Morty's reaction to Bird Person's translation is important too. He doesn't believe it. He says something along the lines of, I got news for you. He's saying it ironically. And honestly, that response makes perfect sense. Because Rick has spent so much time building up his image as a guy who doesn't care about anything, that even his own grandson, the person who spends the most time with him, can't recognize a genuine cry for help when it's right in front of his face. Rick has been so effective at wearing his mask that the truth can be spoken out loud and still nobody takes it seriously. This is one of the most brilliant things about how Rick and Morty handles its main character. The show doesn't hide Rick's pain in some locked vault that only gets opened during dramatic season finales. It puts his pain right on the surface, out in the open, in the form of a catchphrase that sounds like a joke. Rick is literally telling everyone around him that he's suffering, but he's doing it in a way that guarantees nobody will actually respond to it. He gets to release a tiny bit of the pressure building up inside him without ever having to deal with the consequences of actually being vulnerable. It's the perfect defense mechanism for someone who is terrified of letting people in. And this pattern doesn't stop with the catchphrase. Rick wears masks constantly throughout the series, sometimes literally. In Season 2, Episode 7, Big Trouble in Little Sanchez, Rick transfers his consciousness into a younger clone body so he can go to Summer and Morty's high school and help them deal with a vampire that's been hiding among the students. At first, it seems like a fun, lighthearted episode. Tiny Rick, as he starts calling himself, is the life of the party. He's popular, energetic, and everyone at the school loves him. He's singing, dancing, making friends, all the things that the regular old Rick would never allow himself to do. But something starts happening that Tiny Rick can't control. His subconscious begins leaking out. When he plays guitar and improvises song lyrics, the words that come out aren't fun or happy. They're dark. They're about being trapped. They're about needing help. He sings about the real Rick being stuck inside, screaming to get out. And his drawings are even worse. When Tiny Rick draws pictures in class or at parties, they show the old Rick trapped in a vat, desperate, reaching out for someone to save him. His conscious mind is performing the role of a happy, carefree teenager, but his subconscious mind keeps trying to tell the truth. Summer is the one who notices it first. She sees the drawings, she hears the lyrics, and she realizes that something is deeply wrong. That Rick's real self is being suppressed by the younger body, and it's trying to send an SOS through whatever channel it can find. Morty, on the other hand, doesn't want to hear it. He's enjoying having a cool, popular version of his grandfather around. He tries to rationalize what's happening, tries to find a compromise where Tiny Rick can stay. It's only when Summer forces the issue that they eventually get Rick back into his original body. This episode is basically wubba-lubba-dub-dub in a different form. Rick's pain is coming to the surface through creative expression, through music and art, and the people around him either can't see it or don't want to see it. The real Rick is drowning inside a performance of happiness, and his cries for help only come out in ways that are easy to dismiss or ignore. This is something Rick does over and over again throughout the series. He hides the truth inside jokes, inside insults, inside throwaway comments that sound like nothing but actually mean everything. When he tells Morty that love is just a chemical reaction that compels animals to breed, he's not giving a science lecture. He's telling Morty that he's decided love isn't worth believing in anymore because of what happened to him. When he breaks the fourth wall and makes fun of the idea of character arcs and learning lessons, he's not just being meta for comedy. He's expressing his genuine belief that change is pointless, that growth doesn't happen, that people don't get better. These aren't jokes, they're his actual worldview. But because he delivers them as jokes, nobody challenges him on them. Rick's constant belching and slurring serve a similar purpose. On the surface, they're just signs that he's drunk, which he almost always is. But they also function as interruptions. Anytime a conversation gets too real, anytime someone gets too close to asking a genuine question about how Rick feels, the belching and the rambling kick in like a defense system. They break the rhythm of the conversation, they make the other person uncomfortable or annoyed, and they give Rick an exit ramp away from vulnerability. It's the same thing as shouting a nonsense catchphrase. It's noise designed to fill the silence where honesty might otherwise live. Even Rick's arrogance works as a mask. When he constantly reminds everyone that he's the smartest person in the universe, that he's basically a god, that nothing can touch him, that's not confidence. Confident people don't need to announce it every 5 minutes. What Rick is doing is building a wall. If everyone believes he's untouchable, then nobody will try to reach him. If everyone believes he doesn't care, then nobody will expect him to show up emotionally. And if nobody expects anything from him, then he can never disappoint them, which means he can never lose them the way he lost Diane and Beth. That's the real function of all of Rick's masks. They're not about making himself look good. They're about keeping people at a distance. Every layer of performance he adds, the genius act, the drunk act, the nothing matters act, the catchphrase, the belching, the insults, is another inch of space between himself and the possibility of genuine connection. Because genuine connection is what got him hurt in the first place. He connected with Diane. He loved her completely. He chose her over science, over the multiverse, over everything. And she was taken from him. So the lesson Rick took from that experience, whether he realizes it or not, is that caring about people is dangerous. Loving someone gives the universe a weapon to use against you. And if you never let anyone get close enough to matter, then you can never be destroyed like that again. The tragedy is that it doesn't work. Rick pushes everyone away, but he doesn't actually stop caring about them. He loves Morty. He loves Beth. He even, in his own twisted way, cares about Summer and tolerates Jerry. His feelings for his family leak out in exactly the same way his pain leaks out through his catchphrase and his drawings as Tiny Rick. Through the cracks in the performance, in moments he can't fully control. He gives Morty the only survival collar when they're both falling to their deaths. He beats up the devil for hurting Summer. He compliments Beth's cooking when he thinks nobody is paying attention. The love is there. It's always been there. He just can't let himself express it directly because doing so would mean admitting that these people matter to him. And admitting that means accepting that he could lose them too. Bird Person understood this about Rick better than anyone. That's why he translated the catchphrase for Morty in Ricksy Business. He wasn't trying to embarrass Rick or reveal some big secret. He was trying to tell Morty something important. Your grandfather is not okay. He is hurting. And the way he shows it is by hiding it in plain sight, in a form that nobody takes seriously. Bird Person saw through the performance because he'd known Rick long enough to understand what the performance was for. He fought alongside Rick in the rebellion against the Galactic Federation. He witnessed the anger and the grief that drove Rick through decades of violence. He knew that behind every wubba-lubba-dub-dub was a man begging for something he'd never allow himself to receive. And that's perhaps the most heartbreaking part of all of this. Rick isn't incapable of asking for help. He asks for it constantly. He just does it in a language that nobody around him speaks. He wraps his pain in humor and chaos and noise and hopes, somewhere deep down, that someone will hear what he's actually saying. But the mask is too good. The performance is too convincing. And so Rick remains trapped inside his own act, screaming for help in a way that sounds exactly like a celebration. The show even revisits this idea in subtle ways as the series goes on. Rick's catchphrase becomes less frequent in later seasons, which fans have interpreted in different ways. Some think he's just moved past it. Others think the show is telling us that Rick has either gotten better at hiding his pain or worse at expressing it. But the pattern that Wubba Lubba Dub Dub established never really goes away. Rick continues to broadcast his suffering through indirect channels throughout the entire series. He tells people the truth about himself all the time. He just never does it in a way that sounds like the truth. This is what makes Rick Sanchez such a complex character to study. He's not a man who keeps secrets. He's a man who tells his secrets in a voice that nobody listens to. He's not hiding his pain. He's displaying it in a form that everyone mistakes for something else. And until someone learns to hear what he's actually saying, not what he appears to be saying, Rick will keep performing, keep drinking, keep pushing people away, and keep shouting a catchphrase that means, "I am in great pain, please help me," to a room full of people who think he's just having a good time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Speaking of drinking, Rick's masks aren't just emotional. He also uses a very specific, very physical substance to keep the pain at bay. And it's been right there in his hand since the very first frame of the very first episode. A flask that never seems to run empty, fueling a habit that goes far deeper than just liking the taste of alcohol. Section 3. Alcohol as anesthesia. Rick's substance abuse as a coping mechanism. The very first time we ever see Rick Sanchez on screen, he is drunk. Not a little tipsy, not slightly buzzed, drunk. In the pilot episode of Rick and Morty, Rick stumbles into Morty's bedroom in the middle of the night, barely able to stand, with a bottle in his hand and green drool running down his chin. He's slurring his words, rambling about something Morty can barely follow, and insisting that his grandson come with him right now on some kind of urgent adventure. Morty is half asleep. It's the middle of the night. And his grandfather, who has apparently only recently moved back into the family home after being absent for about 20 years, is so intoxicated that he can barely form complete sentences. That is our introduction to Rick Sanchez. Not a dramatic backstory, not a showcase of his genius, a drunk old man waking up a child in the dark. And from that very first scene forward, the bottle never leaves his hand. Not really. For the entire run of the series, across every season, Rick is almost always drinking. He drinks on adventures. He drinks in the garage while he works. He drinks at the dinner table with his family. He drinks in his spaceship. He drinks while fighting aliens. He drinks while saving the world. He drinks while nearly destroying the world. The flask is as much a part of Rick's character design as his lab coat and his blue hair. It's always there. And the show doesn't treat this as a joke. Well, it does sometimes. Rick's drunken ramblings are often played for comedy, and his ability to function at an insanely high level while completely wasted is part of the humor. But underneath the comedy, Rick and Morty is very honest about what Rick's drinking actually is. It's not a fun quirk, it's not a personality trait that makes him more entertaining. Rick drinks because he is in constant, unrelenting pain, and alcohol is the only thing he's found that dulls it enough for him to keep going. That green drool that's become Rick's visual signature, that's not just a random design choice. It's a direct result of his nonstop drinking. He drinks so much and so constantly that his body can't fully process it, and the overflow shows up as that ever-present green residue around his mouth. It's there in almost every episode and almost every scene. The animators put it there on purpose. It's a visual reminder that Rick Sanchez is never sober. Not when he's being a hero, not when he's being a villain, not when he's having a tender moment with Morty. The alcohol is always in his system. It's always working. Now, why does Rick drink? The surface level answer is obvious. He's dealing with trauma that most people can't even begin to imagine. His wife was murdered. His daughter was murdered. The killer erased his wife from every dimension in existence so that Rick could never find another version of her. He spent decades hunting for revenge across an infinite multiverse, killing countless versions of himself along the way. He eventually gave up and settled into a replacement family in a dimension that wasn't even his. That's not just a bad day. That's a lifetime of grief and violence and loss that would break any normal person 10 times over. Of course he drinks. How could he not? But Rick isn't a normal person. He's the smartest man in the universe. And that's actually what makes his drinking worse, not better. Because Rick doesn't just feel his pain the way a regular person would. He understands it. He can see every angle of it. He knows exactly why he's miserable, exactly what caused it, exactly how it changed him, and exactly what it's doing to the people around him. A regular person might drink to forget. Rick drinks because he can't forget. His mind is too powerful to let him escape into blissful ignorance. He remembers everything, understands everything, and can calculate the full weight of every loss he's ever experienced with perfect clarity. Alcohol doesn't erase his pain. It just turns the volume down enough for him to keep functioning. The show gives us a pretty clear picture of what Rick looks like when the alcohol stops working. In autoerotic assimilation, which we'll get to in more detail soon, Rick goes on a massive bender with Unity, his ex, who is a hive mind that controls entire planets. Together, they party on a scale that's hard to even describe. Rick has Unity create scenarios that fulfill his wildest fantasies. They do every drug imaginable, mixed from materials left behind by another hive mind called Beta 7. It's excess on an almost cosmic level. Rick pushes the partying as far as it can possibly go, and it still isn't enough. By the end of the episode, when Unity leaves him, all that partying, all that substance use, all that running from his feelings catches up with him in the worst possible way. But we'll get to exactly what happens in that moment later. What matters for this section is understanding the pattern. Rick uses substances, alcohol primarily, but also whatever else he can get his hands on, the same way he uses his catchphrase, his insults, and his arrogance. It's a barrier. It's another layer between himself and the emotions he refuses to process. Except, unlike the masks we talked about in the last section, alcohol has a physical component. It actually changes how his brain works. It actually numbs the signals. It's the one mask that doesn't require Rick to perform. He doesn't have to pretend to be okay when he's drunk. He just has to keep drinking, and the chemistry does the rest. There are moments throughout the series where we see what Rick is like when the alcohol thins out and his real emotional state starts leaking through. These moments are always uncomfortable, always raw, and always quickly covered up by more drinking or more chaos. When he's sitting alone in the garage late at night, flask in hand, staring at nothing, that's Rick without the performance. When he says something accidentally honest to Morty and then immediately pivots to a joke or a belch, that's the alcohol failing to keep the truth contained. When he goes quiet at the dinner table while the rest of the family argues about something trivial, that's Rick feeling the full distance between himself and the people he lives with, a distance that alcohol created and maintains. The show is careful to show us that Rick's drinking doesn't just affect him, it affects everyone around him. Morty is constantly being dragged into dangerous situations by a grandfather who is, more often than not, operating under the influence. Beth enables Rick's behavior because she's so desperate for his approval that she's willing to overlook almost anything, including the fact that her father is an alcoholic who puts her children in danger on a regular basis. Jerry sees it clearly and tries to call it out, but nobody in the family takes Jerry seriously, so his concerns get dismissed. Summer has her own complicated relationship with Rick that's colored by his drinking and unpredictability. The family dynamic in the Smith household revolves around Rick in a way that's not healthy, and his drinking is at the center of that. When your most powerful, most intelligent family member is also the one who's constantly intoxicated, it creates a situation where everyone else has to adjust their behavior around that person. Beth adjusts by pretending everything is fine. Jerry adjusts by being resentful but powerless. Morty adjusts by going along with whatever Rick wants because saying no doesn't seem like an option. Summer adjusts by trying to be useful so that Rick will notice her. The whole family orbits around Rick's dysfunction, and alcohol is the fuel that keeps that dysfunctional orbit spinning. There's also something important about the fact that Rick is never shown trying to stop drinking. Not once in the entire series does Rick make a serious attempt at sobriety. He never says he wants to quit. He never acknowledges that his drinking is a problem. When other characters bring it up, he either ignores them or deflects with a joke. This isn't because Rick doesn't know he has a problem. Remember, he's the smartest man in the universe. He knows exactly what alcohol is doing to his body and his mind and his relationships. He continues to drink anyway because, from his perspective, the alternative is worse. The alternative is feeling everything he's been numbing for decades. The alternative is being fully present with his grief, his guilt, his loneliness, and his self-hatred without any buffer. And that is something Rick Sanchez is simply not willing to do. This is a pattern that psychologists and therapists see all the time in the real world. People who experience severe trauma often turn to substances as a way to manage the emotions that the trauma created. They're not drinking because they enjoy it. They're drinking because the pain of being sober is unbearable. The substance becomes a survival strategy. It's not a good strategy. It damages the body, it damages relationships, it prevents healing, and it usually makes everything worse in the long run. But in the short term, in the moment, it works. It takes the edge off. It makes the next hour, the next day, the next adventure bearable. And for someone like Rick, who has access to an infinite multiverse of distractions and an intelligence that makes him aware of just how vast and indifferent the universe really is, bearable might be the best he thinks he can hope for. The show also makes a subtle but important connection between Rick's drinking and his approach to relationships. Rick treats alcohol the same way he treats people, as something to consume, use up, and move on from. He goes through flask after flask, the same way he goes through dimensions, adventures, and connections with other beings. Nothing is permanent. Nothing is sacred. Everything is disposable. And that attitude, that willingness to throw things away the moment they stop being useful or comfortable, is something the alcohol both creates and reinforces. It's a cycle. He drinks to avoid feeling, and the drinking makes him worse at feeling, which gives him more reason to drink. Consider the scenes where Rick stumbles out of his spaceship surrounded by empty bottles. The show puts those images in front of us repeatedly. A spaceship capable of traveling across dimensions, one of the most advanced pieces of technology in existence, and the floor is covered in empty bottles. That's Rick's life in a single frame. Unlimited potential, unlimited intelligence, unlimited possibility, all of it swimming in alcohol. He could go anywhere, do anything, be anyone. And what does he do? He drinks and flies. He drinks and invents. He drinks and saves the world. He drinks and destroys it. The drinking is the one constant. Galaxies change, dimensions change, enemies change, adventures change. The flask stays. And here's the thing that makes Rick's alcoholism especially tragic within the context of the show. Rick has the ability to cure almost anything. He's built devices that can alter DNA, transfer consciousness, create life, destroy planets, and bend the laws of physics. If anyone in any fictional universe could develop a cure for addiction, it would be Rick Sanchez. He could probably build a machine that rewires his brain chemistry in an afternoon. He could probably create a serum that eliminates the craving for alcohol entirely. But he doesn't. He never even tries. Because curing his alcoholism would mean removing the one thing that stands between him and the full force of his own emotions. It would mean choosing to feel everything he's been running from. And that choice, for Rick, is scarier than any alien, any government, any version of himself across the multiverse. That's the real tragedy of Rick's relationship with alcohol. It's not that he can't stop, it's that he won't stop. He has the power to fix this particular problem more easily than almost any other problem in the universe, and he actively chooses not to because the problem is also his solution. The drinking is the disease and the treatment at the same time. It's destroying him and keeping him alive simultaneously. And until Rick is willing to face what's waiting for him on the other side of sobriety, the grief, the guilt, the loneliness, the memory of Diane, the flask is going to stay in his hand. The show understands this. It never treats Rick's drinking as something cool or aspirational. Sure, it's part of his image, part of what makes him Rick, but the show also makes sure we see the consequences. We see the family walking on eggshells. We see Morty's anxiety. We see Beth's denial. We see the empty bottles piling up. And most importantly, we see the moments when the alcohol isn't enough. When Rick's pain breaks through, despite everything he's poured on top of it. Those are the moments that remind us that underneath the genius and the chaos and the constant buzz of intoxication, there's a man who is barely holding himself together. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Rick's drinking is a slow form of self-destruction. It's not as dramatic as pointing a weapon at yourself. It's quieter than that. It's more gradual. But it comes from the same place, a desire to escape a pain so deep that sometimes just existing feels like too much. And as we're about to see, there was one moment in the series where even alcohol wasn't enough to keep Rick going. One moment where the pain finally broke through every mask and every substance and every defense he'd ever built. And Rick Sanchez came, closer to ending his own life than he'd ever been before. Section 4, The Darkest Moment. Rick's suicide attempt after Unity. There are episodes of Rick and Morty that make you laugh until your sides hurt. There are episodes that make you think about the universe in ways you never expected from a cartoon. And then there's the ending of Autoerotic Assimilation, Season 2, Episode 3. This is the episode that made an entire fan base go completely silent. No memes, no jokes, no wubba-lubba-dub-dub, just silence. Because in the final minutes of this episode, Rick and Morty stopped being a comedy and became something else entirely. It became one of the most honest, most raw, most devastating depictions of what happens when a person's pain finally becomes bigger than their ability to contain it. To understand why this moment hits so hard, you need to understand what happens in the rest of the episode leading up to it. The story begins with Rick, Morty, and Summer responding to a distress signal from an alien spaceship. Rick explains that 9 times out of 10, a distress signal from a wrecked ship means everyone on board is dead, and there's great stuff to steal. So they board the ship looking for loot. But instead of finding dead aliens, they find surviving crew members who explain that their planet has been taken over by an assimilating hive mind, a being that takes control of other people's minds and absorbs them into itself. Before anyone can process this, the hive mind attacks and takes over the remaining crew members. And then something unexpected happens. The hive mind recognizes Rick, and Rick, looking a little embarrassed, admits to his grandkids that this hive mind is named Unity, and they used to date. That's right, Rick Sanchez once had a romantic relationship with a being that controls entire planets full of people. When you think about it, that actually makes sense for someone like Rick. A single person could never hold his attention for long, but a being that can become anyone, look like anyone, be an entire civilization all at once, that's probably the only kind of partner that could keep up with him. Rick and Unity pick up right where they left off. They go back to Unity's planet, the one Unity has completely taken over, and they start partying. Hard. Unity can make any scenario Rick wants happen. Any fantasy, any desire, any experience, Unity can create by simply controlling the right combination of bodies and environments. Rick asks for things that are wild even by his standards. A stadium full of specific types of people, elaborate scenarios, and Unity delivers on all of it. Because Unity controls every single person on the planet. While Rick and Unity are reconnecting, Summer and Morty are left to explore the planet on their own. Summer is deeply uncomfortable with what Unity is doing. She sees a civilization of people whose free will has been completely erased, walking around smiling and cooperating, but not because they chose to, because they have no choice. Summer tries to free some of them, which backfires badly and starts a race war between the planet's different species, showing that maybe their society wasn't so great before Unity took over either. It's one of those situations where the show refuses to give you an easy answer about who's right and who's wrong. Meanwhile, back on Earth, Beth and Jerry discover a secret underground lair beneath the garage that Rick has apparently been hiding from them. Inside, they find an alien creature that Rick has been keeping imprisoned. Beth and Jerry argue about what to do with it, and their fight quickly turns into a fight about their marriage, about Rick, about everything. At one point, the alien breaks free of its chains just to tell Beth and Jerry that they're both terrible people and their arguments are so pathetic that even a baby-eating alien with space diseases can't stand listening to them. It's one of the funniest moments in the episode, but it also sets up the contrast for what's coming. Back on Unity's planet, things between Rick and Unity start to fall apart. A neighboring hive mind called Beta 7 shows up on a routine visit, and it's obvious that Beta 7 has feelings for Unity. Rick notices that Beta 7 brought materials that can be combined into powerful drugs, and he talks Unity into mixing them up so they can take their partying to another level. This is the turning point. Rick pushes Unity further and further into excess, and Unity goes along with it because that's what Unity does around Rick. Unity loses control of its assimilated population. People start waking up confused. The carefully maintained order of the planet starts crumbling, and it becomes clear that Rick's influence is actively making Unity worse. This is what Unity realizes. This is the thing that forces Unity to make the hardest decision of the episode. At some point, while Rick is in the bathroom, Unity makes a choice. When Rick comes out, the entire planet is empty. Everyone is gone. Unity has left. Every surface in the area is covered with farewell notes, written by the different people Unity was controlling. The notes all say the same thing in different ways. Unity loves Rick. Unity wants to be with Rick. But Unity cannot be with Rick, because being with Rick brings out the worst in Unity. The notes explain that they're two alike. Both of them turn the people around them into reflections of themselves. Unity through assimilation, Rick through influence. Unity writes that being around Rick causes Unity to lose itself, to become part of Rick's chaos, and that the only way to survive is to leave. This is the moment the episode shifts. Up until now, it's been funny, weird, philosophical, and occasionally uncomfortable, but still recognizably a comedy. From this point forward, the comedy is gone. There's nothing funny about what happens next. Rick goes home. He walks through the door, and Beth is waiting for him, angry about the secret lair and the escaped alien. This is the kind of confrontation that Rick would normally handle with ease. He'd make a joke, drop some devastating one-liner, redirect the conversation, and walk away having won. But he doesn't do any of that. He doesn't fight back, he doesn't argue, he just gives in. He concedes to Beth's complaints and quietly retreats to the garage. This moment is so out of character for Rick that it should set off alarm bells for everyone watching. Rick Sanchez does not surrender. He does not give ground. He does not let other people win arguments. The fact that he does here tells you that something inside him has fundamentally broken. In the garage, Rick does something that the show presents without any comedy, any irony, or any dialogue. He walks over to a piece of equipment and starts assembling something. Then he goes to a container where he's been storing a frozen creature. The creature is deformed, distressed, clearly suffering. It's some kind of mutated being that Rick has apparently been keeping alive in stasis. The nature of this creature has been debated by fans for years. Some believe it's connected to the Cronenberg dimension. Some believe it might be related to Unity in some way. The show never tells us exactly what it is, and in a way, that makes the scene even more powerful. We don't need to know what the creature is. What matters is what Rick does with it. He unfreezes it. The creature is in agony, screaming, writhing. And Rick, the man who insults everyone, who mocks everything, who treats the entire multiverse like a joke, reaches out and gently comforts it. He's tender with it. He's kind. He touches it softly, like someone saying goodbye to something they care about, and then he vaporizes it with the device he built. He puts the creature out of its misery. It's an act of mercy. And then he turns the device on himself. Rick positions himself beneath the beam. He sits down at his workstation, puts his head under the device, and waits for it to activate. The song "Do You Feel It" by Chaos Chaos begins playing. There's no dialogue, no jokes, no burping. Just the music and the image of Rick Sanchez, the smartest man in the universe, the man who can solve any problem, the man who has escaped from every trap and beaten every enemy, sitting alone in his garage, waiting to die. The machine powers up. The beam starts to charge. And then Rick passes out. He's so drunk, so completely intoxicated from everything he consumed on Unity's planet and everything he drank on the way home, that he loses consciousness before the machine can finish its cycle. The beam fires, but Rick has slumped forward just enough that it misses him. He survives. Not because he changed his mind. Not because someone saved him. Not because he had a last-second realization that life is worth living. He survives by accident. The alcohol that has been slowly destroying him for years is, in this one moment, the thing that keeps him alive. The irony is almost unbearable. The episode ends with a shot of Rick passed out at his workstation the next morning. The camera slowly pulls back. We see the garage, the house, the driveway. Jerry is outside, happily whacking weeds, completely oblivious to what nearly happened a few feet away on the other side of the garage wall. Life in the Smith household continues as normal. Nobody knows. Nobody checks on him. Nobody asks if he's okay. Rick nearly ended his life, and the world just kept spinning without noticing. This scene is what turned Rick and Morty from a really clever animated comedy into something deeper for a lot of people. Because up until this point, you could watch the show and enjoy it purely on the surface. You could laugh at Rick's one-liners, enjoy the creative science fiction concepts, and treat his nihilism as a cool character trait. But after this scene, you can't unsee what's underneath. You can't go back to thinking Rick's drinking is just a funny habit. You can't go back to thinking his nothing matters attitude is just edgy philosophy, because now you've seen where all of it leads when the masks come off and the pain comes through and there's nobody around to stop what happens next. The reason Unity's departure hit Rick so hard is layered. On the surface, it's a breakup, and breakups hurt everyone. But for Rick, it was more than that. Unity was one of the very few beings in the multiverse who could actually match Rick. Unity could keep up with him intellectually, could give him the stimulation and the chaos he craved, and most importantly, could be with him without being consumed by him the way most individuals are. Unity's decision to leave wasn't based on not loving Rick. Unity loved him. The farewell notes made that completely clear. Unity left because being with Rick was destructive. Unity recognized that Rick makes the people around him worse, that his influence is a kind of assimilation all on its own, and that the only way to protect itself was to walk away from the person it loved. For Rick, that's not just a breakup. That's confirmation of his deepest fear, that he is fundamentally toxic, that loving him is a form of self-harm for the other person, that no matter how powerful he is, no matter how intelligent, no matter how much someone cares about him, being close to Rick Sanchez will eventually destroy you. Diane was destroyed by proximity to Rick because another Rick killed her to punish him. Unity was destroyed by proximity to Rick because his personality was corrosive enough to undo an entire planet. These are very different situations, but they lead to the same conclusion in Rick's mind. Everyone who gets close to me gets hurt. I am the problem. And that's the thought that led Rick to the garage. That's the thought that made him build the device, comfort the dying creature, and turn the beam on himself. Not, I miss my ex-girlfriend, not, I'm sad about a breakup. The thought was something much bigger and much darker. I am incapable of being loved without destroying the person who loves me. I am a poison. The universe would be better off without me in it. The fact that Rick survived by accident rather than by choice is one of the most important details in the entire series. It means that when the next episode starts and Rick is back to his usual sarcastic, drinking, adventuring self, he didn't choose to keep living. He just didn't die. There was no moment of hope, no decision to try again, no hand reaching out to pull him back. He woke up the next morning, still alive, and he kept going because that's what he does. Not because he wanted to, but because he didn't have a choice. And that distinction between choosing to live and simply not dying is something the show never really lets go of, even as the comedy returns and the adventures continue. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This episode showed us the bottom of Rick's pain. It showed us that underneath all the masks, all the alcohol, all the genius and the chaos, there is a man who genuinely does not believe he deserves to be alive. And when you understand that about Rick Sanchez, everything else about him starts making a different kind of sense. His intelligence, the thing that defines him more than anything else, isn't just a tool or a gift. It's connected to his suffering in a way that goes much deeper than just being too smart for his own good. His mind is both his greatest weapon and his heaviest chain. And understanding that connection is the key to understanding everything else about who he is and why he does what he does. Section 5. Intelligence as a curse. The burden of being the smartest man in the universe. Most people think being the smartest person in the room would be amazing. You'd have all the answers. You'd never be wrong. You'd be able to solve any problem, win any argument, and outsmart anyone who tried to get in your way. And on the surface, that's exactly what Rick Sanchez's life looks like. He builds things that shouldn't be possible. He travels across dimensions the way other people walk to the store. He outsmarts gods, governments, and entire civilizations before breakfast. By every measurable standard, Rick's intelligence is the most powerful force in the universe. It should be the thing that makes his life incredible. Instead, it's the thing that's destroying him. Rick's intelligence isn't just high. It's so far beyond everyone else's that it creates a kind of permanent isolation that most people can't even begin to relate to. Think about it this way. Imagine you're the only person on Earth who can read, and everyone else around you is illiterate. At first, that might feel like an advantage. You can access information nobody else can. You can do things nobody else can do. But over time, you'd realize something terrible. You can never share what you've read with anyone. Nobody can understand what you're talking about. Every conversation you have is limited to what the other person is capable of grasping, which is a fraction of what's actually going on in your head. Eventually, you'd start to feel completely alone, not because people aren't around you, but because nobody can meet you where you actually are. Now multiply that by infinity. Because Rick doesn't just know more than the people around him, he knows more than every single being in his section of the multiverse. And that's not an exaggeration. Rick literally helped build something called the central finite curve, which is a kind of barrier around a specific set of realities. Inside the central finite curve, only universes where Rick Sanchez is the smartest person alive are included. He and the other Ricks at the Citadel walled off the multiverse so that they would always, in every single reality, be at the top. This was revealed in Rick Mirai Jack, the Season 5 finale, when evil Morty broke through the central finite curve to escape into the wider multiverse. The part where Ricks aren't necessarily the smartest beings around. That detail tells you something profound about Rick's relationship with his own intelligence. He didn't just happen to be the smartest person everywhere he went. He engineered it. He built a structure that guaranteed it. On one hand, that looks like the ultimate power move. On the other hand, it means Rick chose to live inside a cage. A very large cage, containing countless universes, but a cage nonetheless. He confined himself to a section of reality where he could never be challenged, never be surprised, never encounter someone who might actually understand him. The central finite curve is the largest comfort zone in the history of fiction, and Rick built it because the alternative, existing in a multiverse where he might not always be on top, was too frightening. And that fear connects directly back to what happened with Diane. Rick lost his wife because he wasn't powerful enough to protect her. He wasn't smart enough, wasn't fast enough, wasn't prepared enough. Another version of himself got the drop on him, and Diane paid the price. After that, Rick dedicated his entire existence to making sure he would never be in that position again. The central finite curve, the portal gun, the weapons, the gadgets, the constant drinking to keep his mind from eating itself alive. All of it is Rick's way of saying, I will never be caught off guard again. I will never be the weaker one. I will never lose someone because I wasn't enough. His intelligence isn't just a trait. It's a fortress he built around himself so that the worst day of his life could never repeat. But fortresses are lonely places. And Rick's intelligence, for all the protection it provides, also makes it almost impossible for him to connect with anyone on a meaningful level. We see this over and over again in the show. Rick can't have a normal conversation with Jerry because he sees Jerry as so far beneath him that engaging seriously would be a waste of time. He struggles to connect with Beth because their relationship is warped by decades of abandonment and a power gap that Beth can never close. He loves Morty but constantly talks down to him, drags him into situations he's not equipped for, and uses him as a tool as often as he treats him as a grandson. Even his friendships are limited. Bird Person is probably the closest thing Rick has to a best friend, and even that relationship is built more on shared history and mutual combat experience than on genuine emotional openness. The show gives us one of the clearest windows into this problem in Rick Potion number 9, which is only the 6th episode of the entire series. In that episode, Morty asks Rick to make a love potion so that his crush Jessica will like him. Rick does it because he doesn't particularly care about the consequences. But the potion goes wrong, spreading to the entire population of Earth and mutating everyone into grotesque Cronenberg-like monsters. Rick tries to fix it. He makes it worse. He tries again. Worse still. Eventually, he does something that changes the entire show. Rick finds a parallel dimension, one where the alternate Rick and Morty managed to fix the problem, but then died in an unrelated lab accident shortly after. So Rick takes Morty to this new dimension, they bury the dead bodies of their alternate selves in the backyard, and they simply take over those versions' lives. The family in this dimension doesn't know the difference. As far as Beth, Jerry, and Summer are concerned, their Rick and Morty just walked in from the garage like any other day. Morty is traumatized. He literally had to bury his own corpse. He's shaking, he's horrified, he can barely function. And Rick? Rick is completely calm. He's unbothered. He cracks open a beer and watches TV. This isn't the first time he's done something like this. For Rick, switching dimensions is like changing a shirt. When one reality gets too messed up, you find another one that's close enough, and you move on. People, places, families, They're all replaceable when you have access to infinite versions of everything. This moment is devastating because it shows us exactly what Rick's intelligence has done to his ability to value things. When everything can be replaced, nothing feels truly precious. When there are infinite versions of your daughter, your grandson, your entire world, what makes any single one of them special? Rick knows, on an intellectual level, that the Morty standing next to him is unique. This specific Morty, with this specific set of experiences. But he also knows that there are countless other Mortys out there, and if this one died, he could technically find another one. That knowledge doesn't make Rick a monster. It makes him trapped. He can see the replaceability of everything, including himself, and that awareness drains the meaning out of experiences that should matter. This is what Dr. Wong was getting at in Pickle Rick when she told Rick that he alternates between viewing his own mind as an unstoppable force and as an inescapable curse. That line is one of the most important pieces of dialogue in the entire series, because it captures the exact duality of Rick's intelligence. On his good days, his mind is the thing that lets him do impossible things. He outsmarts Satan himself in Something Ricked This Way Comes. He tears down the entire Galactic Federation's economy single-handedly in The Rickdemption. He builds functioning robots out of garbage, creates miniature universes to power his car battery, and casually invents things that would take entire civilizations millennia to develop. But on his bad days, and Rick has a lot of bad days, that same mind becomes a prison. Because a mind that powerful doesn't have an off switch. Rick can't stop thinking. He can't stop analyzing. He can't stop seeing the patterns, the outcomes, the meaninglessness that comes with understanding too much about how reality actually works. When you know that there are infinite universes, infinite versions of every person, infinite outcomes for every situation, it becomes very hard to believe that anything matters. Why save this particular world when there are infinite others? Why protect this particular family when there are infinite copies? Why care about this particular life when death is just a transition from one arrangement of atoms to another? This is the core of Rick's nihilism, and it's important to understand that it doesn't come from laziness or edginess. It comes from information. Rick has seen too much. He knows too much. His brain processes reality at a level that strips away the comforting illusions that most people rely on to get through the day. Most people believe their lives matter because they don't have proof that they don't. Rick has that proof. He's visited the proof. He's had dinner with the proof and then abandoned it in a Cronenberg dimension. His nihilism isn't a philosophy he chose. It's a conclusion his intelligence forced on him. And yet, despite all of this, Rick can't fully commit to not caring. That's the part that tortures him the most. If he truly believed nothing mattered, he'd be at peace. He'd be a calm, detached observer, floating through the multiverse, with no emotional investment in anything. But he's not that. He's angry. He's bitter. He's in pain. He drinks constantly. He almost killed himself. You don't try to end your own life if you genuinely believe nothing matters. You only do that if things matter so much that the weight of them becomes unbearable. Rick's intelligence tells him that nothing should matter, but his heart keeps insisting that things do. And the war between those two forces is what's tearing him apart. We see this war play out in the Ricks Must Be Crazy, where Rick has created a miniature universe inside his car battery. Inside that universe, an entire civilization exists, generating power that Rick uses to charge his car. When the inhabitants of that universe create their own miniature universe to generate their own power, essentially copying Rick's idea, Rick is furious. He goes down into the nested universes to fix the problem, and we watch him casually manipulate and threaten entire civilizations to get what he wants. To Rick, these are just tiny people inside a battery. Their lives, their dreams, their entire reality exists solely to power his vehicle. But the episode doesn't let Rick off the hook. It forces you to ask, isn't that what Rick's life is like to whatever's above him? If the people in his car battery are meaningless because they exist inside a container Rick controls, then what does that say about Rick's own existence? He's smart enough to see the parallel, and that's the kind of thought that keeps him up at night. His intelligence lets him play God with smaller beings, but it also forces him to confront the possibility that he might be just as small and just as meaningless in the grand scheme of things. This is why Rick drinks. This is why he wears masks. This is why he pushes people away. It's not just the trauma of losing Diane, although that's the wound that started everything. It's also the burden of a mind that can see too much, understand too much, and feel too much, while simultaneously telling him that none of it should matter. His intelligence is the tool that could save him, and the weapon that's destroying him. And he can't separate the two because they're the same thing. The smartest man in the universe is also the most miserable. Not despite his intelligence, but because of it. Dr. Wong saw this clearly in their one meaningful interaction. She didn't try to challenge Rick intellectually. She knew she couldn't beat him in a battle of wits. Instead, she went straight for the thing his intelligence couldn't protect him from: the truth about his emotional life. She told him that the only connection between his intelligence and the sickness destroying his family is that everyone, including Rick, uses that intelligence to justify the sickness. In other words, Rick's brain isn't causing his problems. It's the excuse he uses to avoid fixing them. He tells himself he's too smart for therapy, too smart for emotional work, too smart to need other people. But that's not intelligence talking. That's fear wearing the disguise of intelligence. And that disguise is so convincing that even Rick believes it most of the time. He genuinely thinks that his refusal to engage with his emotions is a rational choice made by a superior mind. He genuinely thinks that therapy is beneath him, that vulnerability is weakness, that caring about people is an inefficiency that a truly logical being would eliminate. But as Dr. Wong pointed out, and as the show has demonstrated over and over again, Rick is not a purely logical being. He's a deeply emotional person who has built an entire identity around pretending he isn't. And his intelligence is the building material he uses to construct that pretense. The tragedy of Rick Sanchez is not that he's too smart for his own good. It's that he's exactly smart enough to see all of his problems with perfect clarity and still not fix them. He can diagnose his own pain with the precision of a surgeon, but he can't bring himself to operate. He can map the entire landscape of his own dysfunction, but he refuses to take a single step toward changing it, because changing would mean admitting that the smartest man in the universe has been wrong about the most important things. That caring isn't weakness, that connection isn't dangerous, and that the boring, difficult work of being a person is worth doing even when you're smart enough to see how pointless the universe can be. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And nowhere is that refusal to change more perfectly captured than in one specific episode, where Rick literally transforms his own body into a completely different form of life rather than sit in a room and talk about his feelings for 1 hour. That episode tells you everything you need to know about how far Rick will go to avoid doing the one thing that might actually help him. Section 6. Pickle Rick, the anatomy of avoidance. Rick Sanchez has outrun alien armies. He's escaped from maximum security prisons in other galaxies. He's dismantled governments, outsmarted beings who consider themselves gods, and built technology that breaks the laws of physics on a daily basis. There is almost nothing in the known universe that Rick cannot handle. But there is one thing that terrifies him more than any monster, more than any enemy, more than death itself. Sitting in a room with his family and the therapist and talking about how he feels. That's the setup for Pickle Rick, Season 3, Episode 3. And it is hands down one of the most important episodes in the entire series when it comes to understanding Rick's psychology. On the surface, it's famous for being the episode where Rick turns himself into a pickle and goes on a violent rampage through a sewer and a foreign government building. The internet went crazy for it. Pickle Rick became a meme, a Halloween costume, a catchphrase. People loved the action, the absurdity, the image of a tiny green pickle killing rats and building weapons out of office supplies. But all of that spectacle, as entertaining as it is, exists to make one very specific point about Rick Sanchez. And that point is this: Rick would rather risk death in the most extreme, painful, and ridiculous way imaginable than spend 60 minutes being emotionally honest. Here's what happens. Beth has scheduled a family therapy session. This isn't something she decided to do on a whim. The session was recommended by the school because Summer had been caught huffing pottery enamel and Morty had been wetting his pants in class. Both of these behaviors were identified as signs that the kids were struggling to cope with their parents' recent divorce. Beth and Jerry had split up at the end of season 2, and the fallout was hitting Summer and Morty hard enough that the school stepped in and said this family needs professional help. So Beth books an appointment with a therapist named Dr. Wong. The whole family is supposed to go. Beth, Summer, Morty, and Rick. And Rick wants absolutely no part of it. Not just in a casual, I'd rather not kind of way. Rick wants to avoid this therapy session so badly that he goes into his garage and uses his genius-level scientific abilities to transform his entire body, his cells, his organs, his physical form, into a pickle. A literal pickle. He lies on his workstation, green and cylindrical and completely helpless. And when Morty comes in and finds him, Rick acts like this is just a fun science experiment. He tells Morty to be impressed. He says, "I'm Pickle Rick," like it's the greatest achievement of his career. But Morty isn't impressed. Morty is suspicious. He notices a syringe of mysterious liquid hanging directly above Rick on a string that's connected to a pair of scissors attached to a timer. The timer is set for exactly 10 minutes from now, which is exactly when the family would have left for therapy. In other words, Rick set up a system where he would turn himself into a pickle. The family would leave for therapy without him because obviously a pickle can't go to a therapist, and then the syringe would automatically inject him with a serum that would turn him back to normal once they were gone. It's an elaborate, carefully planned escape route designed for one purpose: to avoid therapy. Rick tries to brush off Morty's questions. He says the syringe is completely unrelated and doesn't need further explanation. But Beth walks in, sees what's happening, and immediately understands what Rick is doing. And here's the part that shows just how well Beth knows her father. She doesn't argue with him. She doesn't try to convince him to come. She doesn't beg or plead or give a speech about how the family needs him there. She just takes the syringe and walks out. She takes Rick's escape route and leaves him stranded as a pickle on the workstation with no way to turn himself back. This is a pivotal moment because it's one of the very few times in the series where someone successfully outmaneuvers Rick. Beth saw through his plan instantly and removed his safety net. And now Rick is stuck. He's a pickle. He can't move. He has no arms, no legs, no tools, no technology. He's just a pickle lying on a table. And the therapy session is happening without him. By every logical measure, Rick has lost. He should just lie there and wait for someone to come back and deal with the situation. But that's not what Rick does. Because for Rick, being stranded as a helpless pickle with no way to turn back into a human is still preferable to therapy. Let that sink in. He would rather be a dying vegetable on a countertop than talk about his feelings. So, instead of giving up, Rick rolls himself off the workstation, falls into a gutter drain, and gets flushed into the sewer. And that's where the action movie begins. In the sewer, Rick is just a pickle. No gadgets, no portal gun, no flask, nothing. But he's still the smartest being in the universe, and intelligence doesn't go away just because your body has changed. Rick lures a cockroach toward him, kills it by biting into its head, and then uses parts of the cockroach's brain and nervous system to create a crude way to move himself around. He essentially turns cockroach parts into a control system that lets him walk and manipulate objects. From there, he encounters a rat, kills it using an elaborate trap he builds from tiny pieces of debris, and then constructs a full exosuit out of the rat's body. He wears the dead rat like a mech suit, using its limbs as his own, with the cockroach brain as the interface. Let me say that again. Rick, as a pickle, built a functional body out of dead rats and cockroaches in a sewer. That's how far his intelligence can take him, even in the most desperate circumstances. And that's also how far he's willing to go to avoid sitting in a chair and answering questions about his emotional state. From the sewer, Rick ends up inside a foreign government building filled with armed agents. It's never made entirely clear which country's building it is, but the agents speak Russian and the whole setup looks like some kind of paramilitary compound. Rick, in his rat suit, proceeds to absolutely destroy everyone inside. He builds weapons from office supplies, pins, rubber bands, staples, batteries. He sets traps, He rigs explosions. He takes out dozens of trained agents using nothing but his mind and whatever he can find lying around. The director of the building calls in a last resort, a captured fighter named Jaguar, who is essentially an action movie hero held prisoner by the government. Jaguar is sent to kill Rick, and instead, they end up having an encounter that plays out like a scene from an 80s action film, complete with mutual respect between two killers who recognize something in each other. The entire sequence is incredible. It's exciting, it's creative, it's funny, and it's a showcase for just how dangerous Rick is, even when he's been stripped of every advantage. But the show is very clear about what this sequence actually represents. All of this, the cockroach surgery, the rat suit, the paramilitary massacre, the fight with Jaguar, all of it is avoidance behavior. Rick went through all of this because the alternative was therapy. He chose a path where he could die, rather than a path where he might have to feel something. Meanwhile, at Dr. Wong's office, the therapy session is happening without Rick. Beth, Summer, and Morty are sitting on the couch, and Dr. Wong is trying to get them to open up. Beth immediately starts talking about how Rick is a genius, how he couldn't make it, how important he is. She's defensive, protective, and completely unwilling to engage with the actual reason they're there. Her kids are falling apart because of the divorce. Summer calls out the obvious. Rick lied and turned himself into a pickle to skip this session. Beth deflects. Morty notices some interesting things about the office, including a book about people who eat feces, which is apparently Dr. Wong's other specialty. The therapy session is awkward, uncomfortable, and exactly the kind of real, messy, human experience that Rick was trying to avoid. Then Rick shows up. He crashes into the office, barely alive, covered in rat blood, still in pickle form, with his rat suit falling apart. He asks Beth for the serum to turn him back into a human. And now, despite everything he did to avoid this exact moment, Rick is sitting in Dr. Wong's office. He's on the couch. He's a pickle covered in rat guts and sewage. And Dr. Wong asks him a simple question. Why didn't he want to come here? Rick's answer is one of the most revealing monologues in the series. He says he doesn't respect therapy. He says he's a scientist. He says he invents, transforms, creates, and destroys for a living. And when he doesn't like something about the world, he changes it. He says he doesn't think going to a rented office in a strip mall to listen to some, quote, agent of averageness explain which words mean which feelings has ever helped anyone do anything. He says therapy helps people get comfortable and stop panicking, which is a state of mind we value in the animals we eat, but not something he wants for himself. He says he's not a cow, he's a pickle, when he feels like it. It's a great speech. It's sharp, it's articulate, it's dripping with Rick's trademark contempt for anything he considers beneath him. And it's also complete nonsense, because everything Rick just said is a rationalization. It's his intelligence doing exactly what Dr. Wong is about to point out, being used to justify sickness rather than cure it. Dr. Wong's response is the single most important piece of dialogue in the entire episode, and arguably one of the most important in the entire series. She doesn't try to match Rick's intelligence. She doesn't try to out-argue him or impress him with her knowledge. She does something much more devastating. She tells him the truth in the simplest, most direct way possible. She tells Rick that the only connection between his unquestionable intelligence and the sickness destroying his family is that everyone in his family, Rick included, uses intelligence to justify sickness. She tells him that he seems to alternate between viewing his own mind as an unstoppable force and as an inescapable curse. And she says that she thinks this is because the only truly unapproachable concept for Rick is that his mind is within his control, that he could choose to use it differently, that the way he lives is a choice, not a destiny. Then she delivers the knockout blow. She tells him that therapy is not an adventure. There's no way to do it so wrong that you might die. It's just work. Boring, repetitive, unglamorous work. Like brushing your teeth. Like cleaning up after yourself. Like maintaining the things in your life that matter. And the bottom line, she says, is that some people are okay going to work. And some people would rather die. Rick has no response. For maybe the first time in the entire series up to this point, Rick Sanchez has nothing to say. No comeback, no sarcastic deflection, no scientific explanation for why she's wrong. He just sits there. A pickle covered in rat blood on a therapist's couch, completely and totally exposed by a woman in a strip mall office who saw through every single one of his defenses without breaking a sweat. The session ends. Doctor. Wong gives the family her card and tells them she hopes to hear from them again. On the ride home, something small but significant happens. Summer and Morty both say they want to keep going to therapy. They want to do the work. They want to get better. And then Beth and Rick, the two people in the family who are most alike, dismiss the whole thing. Rick apologizes to Beth for lying about the pickle, and Beth injects him with the serum, turning him back to normal. Then the two of them go out for a drink together, leaving Summer and Morty's request for continued therapy completely unaddressed. That ending is heartbreaking in a quiet way. The kids saw value in the process. They wanted help. And their role models, the father and the daughter who worship intelligence above all else, walked away from it without a second thought. Rick survived an impossible gauntlet of violence and ingenuity only to end up right back where he started, having learned nothing and changed nothing. The episode gave him the answer. Dr. Wong laid it out perfectly, and Rick chose to ignore it. This is what makes Pickle Rick so much more than a funny meme or a cool action sequence. It's a complete psychological profile of Rick Sanchez delivered in 22 minutes. He would rather build a body out of dead animals and fight a small army than be vulnerable. He would rather risk his life in the most extreme way possible than sit quietly and admit that he's broken. He has the intelligence to solve any problem in the universe except the one that actually matters, which is himself. And when someone finally tells him exactly what's wrong and exactly how to fix it, he gets in the car and goes drinking with his daughter instead. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Dr. Wong called it perfectly. Some people would rather die than do the work. And up to this point in the series, Rick Sanchez is very much one of those people. But what makes his avoidance even more fascinating is what we learn about Rick's inner world when the show actually does manage to crack him open and separate him into pieces. Because in another episode, a machine literally extracts what Rick considers to be his worst qualities and turns them into a separate living being. And what ends up in the toxic pile reveals something about Rick that even he might not fully understand. Section 7. What Rick considers toxic. The revelation of rest and Ricklaxation. If you could remove every part of yourself that you thought was bad, every trait you considered a weakness, every quality you believed was holding you back, would you? Do it. And more importantly, what would be left? That's the question at the heart of Rest and Ricklaxation, Season 3, Episode 6. And the answer the show gives us is one of the most psychologically revealing moments in the entire series. Because when a machine literally separates Rick Sanchez into his, quote, healthy self and his, quote, toxic self, what ends up on each side tells us more about how Rick sees himself than any monologue or flashback ever could. The episode starts with something we almost never see on Rick and Morty. The aftermath of an adventure that actually took a toll. Usually, Rick and Morty go on some wild mission, and by the next scene, they're fine. Back at the dinner table, back at school, moving on like nothing happened. But this time is different. Rick and Morty have just survived a 6-day adventure involving some kind of crystal recovery mission that went horribly wrong. We don't see the adventure itself, just the tail end of it, and both Rick and Morty are absolutely wrecked. They're receiving medals at some kind of ceremony, looking like they've been through a war. And when they get home, they don't celebrate. They break down. Rick and Morty are both on the edge of a full mental collapse. They're shaking, they're panicking, they can barely hold themselves together. This is one of the very few times in the series where Rick openly admits that he's not okay. He doesn't mask it with a joke, he doesn't drink it away. He's genuinely falling apart. And so is Morty. So Rick suggests they go to an alien spa to decompress. It sounds reasonable enough. Even the smartest man in the universe needs a break sometimes. At the spa, they find a machine that claims to remove, quote, cognitive toxins. Think of it like a mental detox. You step in, and the machine pulls out all the psychological stuff that's weighing you down. Rick and Morty both use it, and they immediately feel better, lighter, calmer, like a weight has been lifted off their shoulders. They leave the spa feeling great, and for a few scenes, everything seems wonderful. Rick is polite. Rick is considerate. Rick is patient. He's everything that normal Rick is not. And Morty? Morty is confident. Morty is charming. Morty walks with his head up instead of his shoulders hunched. He starts talking to people he'd normally be too nervous to approach. He's the version of himself that he's always wished he could be. But here's where it gets interesting. The machine didn't just remove bad feelings. It removed what each person subjectively considered to be their toxic qualities and turned those qualities into separate, living beings. Inside the machine's storage tank, which looks like a vast toxic wasteland from the inside, Toxic Rick and Toxic Morty wake up. At first, Toxic Rick thinks the machine exploded and destroyed the spa, but he quickly figures out the truth. They're not Rick and Morty. They're the parts of Rick and Morty that the machine identified as toxins. They're the rejected pieces, the qualities that Rick and Morty themselves believed were their worst traits. Now, what ends up in Toxic Rick is pretty much what you'd expect at first glance. He's got Rick's arrogance cranked up to the maximum. He's cruel, he's rude, he's aggressive. He insults Toxic Morty constantly, calling him worthless and pathetic. He has Rick's narcissism, Rick's rage, Rick's contempt for anyone he considers beneath him. All the qualities that make Rick hard to be around, all the traits that push people away and damage his relationships, they're all concentrated in Toxic Rick, like a distilled version of everything wrong with the man. But then the episode reveals something that changes the entire picture. Toxic Rick also has something that Clean Rick does not. Toxic Rick has Rick's love for Morty. Let that settle in for a moment. When Rick's mind was split into the parts he considers healthy and the parts he considers toxic, his emotional attachment to his grandson ended up in the toxic pile. Rick Sanchez, deep down in the core of his being, considers his love for Morty to be a weakness, a flaw, a toxic trait that holds him back and makes him vulnerable. The machine didn't decide this. Rick's own subconscious decided it. The machine only separates what the person themselves believes is toxic about them, and Rick believes that caring about Morty is one of his worst qualities. This explains so much about how Rick behaves throughout the entire series. Every time he pushes Morty away, every time he says something cruel to him, every time he drags him into danger without seeming to care, it's not because Rick doesn't love Morty. It's because Rick considers that love to be dangerous. Love is what got Diane killed. Love is what made him vulnerable to Rick Prime. Love is the emotion that has caused him more pain than any enemy, any adventure, any threat in the multiverse. So when the machine asks Rick's subconscious, "What do you consider toxic about yourself?" one of the first things that comes up is his attachment to the people he cares about. Clean Rick, on the other hand, is what Rick thinks his ideal self would look like. And Clean Rick is interesting because he's not evil. He's not cold in a villainous way. He's just detached. He's polite, he's reasonable, he's calm, and he genuinely wants to do the right thing. But he lacks emotional depth. He doesn't feel urgency about anything. He doesn't have that desperate, raw energy that drives normal Rick. When Toxic Rick escapes from the machine and starts causing chaos, Clean Rick responds, but not out of passion or love or protective instinct. He responds because it's the logical thing to do. He's efficient, but empty. He functions, but he doesn't feel. He's the version of Rick that Rick wishes he could be, and that version turns out to be incomplete in ways that actually matter. The contrast between Clean Rick and Toxic Rick is the episode's central thesis about personality and self-perception. We tend to think of our flaws as things that hold us back, things we'd be better off without. But the episode argues that the so-called toxic parts of ourselves are often deeply intertwined with the parts that make us who we are. Rick's arrogance is connected to his drive. His rage is connected to his passion. His emotional attachments are connected to his ability to care about anything at all. You can't just remove the bad stuff and keep the good stuff, because they're not separate systems. They're the same system, expressing itself in different ways depending on the situation. Toxic Morty is equally revealing, though in a different direction. Toxic Morty has inherited all of Morty's self-doubt, his anxiety, his fear, and his insecurity. He's a trembling, whimpering version of Morty who can barely function. Meanwhile, Clean Morty is confident, smooth, and utterly without conscience. Clean Morty quickly becomes popular at school, starts dating, and eventually moves to New York, where he becomes a ruthless stockbroker. He's successful by every external measure, but he's also a borderline terrible person. His empathy was removed along with his anxiety because Morty's subconscious considered both of them to be weaknesses holding him back. Without his insecurity, Morty also lost his kindness. Without his fear, he also lost his moral compass. The episode's climax brings all of this to a head in a way that proves the show's point perfectly. Toxic Rick escapes the machine and makes it back to Earth. He builds a device to toxify the entire planet, essentially trying to remake the world in his image. Clean Rick needs to stop him. And here's where the psychological chess match gets brilliant. Clean Rick figures out how to beat Toxic Rick not through technology or brute force, but through understanding how Rick's own mind works. He shoots Toxic Morty with a poison. He then tells Toxic Rick that the only way to save Toxic Morty is for the toxic versions to merge back with their clean counterparts. Toxic Rick calls it a bluff at first, but Clean Rick ups the poison dose, making it clear that Toxic Morty will die without the merger. And Toxic Rick, the version of Rick that contains all his rage, all his narcissism, all his worst impulses, breaks. He can't let Morty die. Even the absolute worst version of Rick Sanchez, the distilled essence of everything he hates about himself, would rather surrender than watch his grandson suffer. This is the proof. This is the episode showing us beyond any doubt that Rick's love for Morty is real, it's deep, and it exists even in the darkest, most damaged corners of his personality. It's not a performance. It's not a strategy. It's so fundamental to who Rick is that even when everything else about him is stripped away and sorted into categories, the love survives. It just happens to live in the same place as his anger and his cruelty and his self-destruction, which is why Rick experiences it as toxic rather than healing. When Toxic Rick merges with Clean Rick, we get normal Rick back. All of him, the genius, the anger, the love, the nihilism, the humor, the pain. The episode essentially argues that you can't have Rick without all of it. The traits he considers toxic are load-bearing walls in his personality. Remove them, and the whole structure collapses into something that might look healthier on the surface, but is fundamentally hollow underneath. Morty's storyline reinforces this in its own way. After the merger, Clean Morty doesn't want his toxic half back. He's been thriving without it. He's confident, successful, and free from the anxiety that's plagued him his entire life. He runs away to New York and builds a new life as a stockbroker. It takes Rick tracking him down and forcibly re-injecting his toxic traits for Morty to become himself again. And here's the small but powerful detail at the end. When Morty is back to his normal, anxious, insecure self, Jessica tells him she's glad he's back. She missed the real Morty. The implication is clear. The version of Morty without his toxic traits wasn't actually better. He was just different. And different in ways that made him less human, less relatable, and less capable of genuine connection. There's also a subtle hint that Morty wanted to be caught. When Jessica calls him in New York, Morty doesn't hang up the phone. He leaves the line open, which allows Rick to trace his location. It's never stated outright, but the suggestion is that somewhere deep down, even Clean Morty knew he was incomplete. He knew something was missing, even if his conscious mind didn't want to admit it. Rest and Ricklaxation is crucial to understanding Rick's psychology because it turns his inner world into something we can actually see and examine. Normally, we have to guess at what's going on inside Rick's head based on his actions and his occasional moments of vulnerability. But this episode literally splits him open and shows us the contents. And what we find is a man who has classified his own capacity for love as a disease. A man who sees emotional connection as contamination. A man whose ideal version of himself is someone who doesn't care about anyone because caring is what got him hurt. And avoiding that hurt has become more important to him than anything else. The episode also raises a question that the show keeps coming back to throughout its run. If Rick knows that his love for Morty is something he considers toxic, and if he knows that this classification is itself a symptom of his trauma and his avoidance, then why doesn't he do something about it? Why doesn't he try to change how he sees his own emotions? The answer, frustratingly but honestly, is the same answer the show has been giving us since the beginning. Because doing something about it would require the boring, unglamorous work that Dr. Wong described. It would require therapy, It would require vulnerability. It would require Rick to stop treating his emotional life as a problem to be solved with science, and start treating it as something that demands patience, honesty, and the willingness to be uncomfortable. And Rick, as we've established, would rather turn himself into a pickle, build a body out of dead rats, and fight an army of armed agents than do any of that. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But Rest and Ricklaxation doesn't just tell us about Rick's relationship with Morty, it also illuminates a much broader pattern in his behavior. His overwhelming, all-consuming need to be in control. Because when you look at what clean Rick lacks and what toxic Rick has in excess, you start to see that the divide isn't really between good Rick and bad Rick. It's between Rick who is in control of everything and Rick who is controlled by his emotions. And that need for control, that desperate, relentless drive to be the one holding all the power in every situation, is something that reaches far beyond his relationship with his grandson. It shapes how he treats his daughter, how he treats the multiverse, and how he built the very structure of reality itself to make sure he would never, ever be at someone else's mercy again. Section 8. The God Complex and the Need for Control. Rick Sanchez doesn't just want to be smart. He doesn't just want to be powerful. Rick wants to be the one in charge of everything, everywhere, at all times. And when you look at his life, really look at it, from the moment Diane died to the present day, you start to see that almost everything Rick does, every invention he builds, every relationship he manages, every system he creates, is designed to make sure he is never at the mercy of someone else ever again. Rick's need for control isn't about ego. It's about survival. It's a trauma response that grew so large it reshaped the entire multiverse. To understand where this need comes from, you have to go back to the moment that broke him. When Rick Prime sent that bomb through the portal and killed Diane and Beth, Rick was powerless. He couldn't stop it. He didn't see it coming. The smartest man in the universe was caught completely off guard, and the two people he loved most in existence paid the price. That experience taught Rick a lesson that he has never, not for one single day since, forgotten. If you are not in control, you can lose everything. If someone else has power over your situation, they can destroy you. The only way to be safe is to make sure that nobody, anywhere, ever has more power than you do. And Rick took that lesson and ran with it further than any human being in fiction has ever run with anything. Start with the most obvious example, the central finite curve. This is something Rick helped design and build during his time leading the Citadel of Ricks. The central finite curve is essentially a wall around a specific section of the multiverse. Inside this wall, only realities where Rick Sanchez is the smartest being in the universe are included. Every dimension, every timeline, every version of reality that exists within the central finite curve is one where Rick is on top. He literally partitioned infinity to guarantee his own supremacy. Think about the scale of that for a moment. Rick didn't just want to be the smartest person on Earth. He didn't just want to be the smartest person in his galaxy. He wanted to be the smartest person in every possible version of reality that he might ever visit. And rather than simply trusting that his intelligence would be enough, he built a structure that made it a certainty. He removed the possibility of encountering someone smarter than him. He eliminated the variable entirely. That's not confidence. That's fear wearing the costume of confidence. A truly confident person doesn't need to rig the game. Rick rigged the entire multiverse because somewhere deep inside him, he's terrified that if he isn't the most powerful person in the room will kill him. The Citadel of Ricks itself is another expression of this same need. The Citadel was originally formed by other Ricks across the multiverse as a way to stop Rick C-137 from killing them during his decades-long hunt for Rick Prime. These Ricks essentially surrendered. They came together and said, "We give up. Let's form a society instead of fighting." And what did Rick C-137 do? He didn't just join them, he took over. He oversaw the construction of the Citadel. He became their leader. He shaped the entire structure of their civilization. Even a group of beings who were all versions of himself couldn't be allowed to exist outside of his influence. He had to be in charge. He had to be the one calling the shots. And then there's what the Citadel did with Morty's. This is one of the darker details in the show's lore. The Ricks at the Citadel figured out that Morty's brainwaves could be used to camouflage Rick's genius-level brainwaves from detection by enemies like the Galactic Federation. So they manipulated the flow of realities to ensure that in every dimension within the central finite curve, Beth would meet Jerry and they would have children, producing an endless supply of Mortys. They essentially engineered the existence of an entire generation of children across infinite realities so that those children could serve as living shields for their grandfathers. Rick was aware of this. He may have been directly involved in setting it up. The show strongly implies that he at least knew about the mass cloning of Mortys at the Citadel to serve as sidekicks and camouflage. That's control on a scale that's genuinely horrifying when you stop and think about it. But Rick's need for control doesn't just show up in these massive, multiverse-spanning projects. It shows up in the small moments, too, in the day-to-day dynamics of the Smith household. Rick has positioned himself as the most important person in the family, and he maintains that position through a combination of usefulness, manipulation, and the systematic undermining of anyone who might threaten his place at the top. Jerry is the most obvious target. Rick treats Jerry with open contempt throughout the entire series. He insults his intelligence, mocks his accomplishments, dismisses his opinions, and makes it clear at every opportunity that he considers Jerry to be worthless. And while some of this is just Rick being Rick, there's a strategic element to it as well. Jerry is Beth's husband. He's the other adult authority figure in the house. If Jerry had a strong position in the family, he could potentially challenge Rick's influence over Beth and the kids. So Rick keeps Jerry small. He keeps Jerry embarrassed, insecure, and perpetually on the defensive. By the time Beth and Jerry briefly separate at the end of Season 2, Rick has been so effective at undermining Jerry that Beth choosing Rick over her own husband feels almost inevitable. Rick didn't necessarily plan that outcome specifically, but his constant erosion of Jerry's standing in the family made it possible. Beth's relationship with Rick is controlled in a different way. Rick controls Beth through her desire for his approval. Beth worships her father. She idolizes him. She wants desperately to be seen as smart enough, tough enough, and independent enough to earn his respect. And Rick knows this. He doesn't give her that approval freely or consistently. He doles it out in small amounts, just enough to keep Beth oriented toward him, always chasing, always trying to prove herself. This is the dynamic that Dr. Wong identified in Pickle Rick. Beth admires Rick's self-sufficiency, but what she's really admiring is his emotional unavailability, because that's what she's been trained to see as strength. Rick's control over his environment even extends to physical spaces. In Pickle Rick, when Rick eventually starts going to Dr. Wong's office with the family on a semi-regular basis, it's revealed that he installed voice-activated escape contingencies throughout the office. These aren't just simple exits. They include methods that could kill Dr. Wong. Rick literally booby-trapped his therapist's office. He couldn't stand being in a space that someone else controlled, so he made it his own by wiring it with weapons and escape routes. Even in a place specifically designed for him to let go of control, Rick made sure he had the upper hand. There's also the way Rick handles threats and enemies. He doesn't just defeat them. He dominates them. He dismantles them so completely that they can never threaten him again. In The Rick Shank Rickdemption, Rick doesn't just escape from the Galactic Federation's prison. He turns himself in on purpose so he can access their systems from the inside, then collapses their entire economy by changing the value of their currency to zero. He doesn't just beat them, he destroys their entire civilization's financial structure in a single move. That's not self-defense. That's the behavior of someone who needs to make absolutely certain that nobody will ever have power over him again. In Something Ricked This Way Comes, Rick encounters the devil, literally Satan, operating a store that gives people cursed items. Most people would avoid the situation or try to break one specific curse. Rick reverse engineers every single cursed item in the store, removes the curses, and opens his own competing shop across the street just to destroy the devil's business out of spite. When the devil is left broken and humiliated, Rick loses interest and moves on. It was never about helping people or stopping evil. It was about proving that nobody, not even a being from religious mythology, could operate in Rick's world without his permission. This pattern of total domination extends to how Rick builds his technology. His portal gun is the most powerful piece of technology in the show. It gives Rick the ability to go anywhere, anytime, and escape any situation. It's the ultimate control tool. If things go wrong, Rick can simply leave. He can abandon any reality, any planet, any relationship, and step through a portal to somewhere new. The portal gun means Rick never has to stay and deal with consequences. He never has to face the fallout of his actions. He can always just go somewhere else. That level of escape isn't freedom. It's avoidance built into a piece of hardware. And Rick's spaceship is another layer of control. The ship has an AI that Rick programmed with Diane's voice. Even the voice of his dead wife has been repurposed as a tool, something Rick controls and uses to serve his needs rather than something he mourns or honors. His car battery contains an entire miniature universe of beings who exist solely to generate power for him, as shown in The Ricks Must Be Crazy. Rick created life itself, an entire civilization, so that they would serve his purposes. When those beings tried to gain independence by creating their own power source, Rick went in and reasserted his control. He needs everything, everywhere, to be under his authority. The sad truth underneath all of this is that Rick's control never actually makes him feel safe. That's the paradox at the center of his character. He's built the most elaborate, most comprehensive system of control that any being in fiction has ever constructed. He controls the multiverse, controls his family dynamics, controls the physical spaces around him, controls the technology he uses, and even controls how close people are allowed to get to him emotionally. And none of it works. He's still miserable. He still drinks constantly. He still pushes people away. He still almost killed himself. All the control in the multiverse can't fix what's actually wrong with Rick, because what's wrong with Rick isn't a lack of control. It's grief. It's loneliness. It's the inability to process the loss of Diane and the life he could have had. No amount of power can undo that. No amount of dominance over others can fill that hole. Rick built a fortress so large it contains infinite realities, and he's still alone inside it. He made himself the smartest, most powerful being in his section of the multiverse, and he still can't outrun his own pain. He engineered a world where nothing can threaten him, and the biggest threat to his well-being is still himself. Control was supposed to be the answer. It was supposed to make him safe. Instead, it just gave him a more elaborate cage to be miserable in. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And nowhere is the failure of Rick's control strategy more visible than in his relationship with Morty. Because no matter how much Rick tries to manage, manipulate, and maintain the upper hand in that relationship, the truth keeps leaking through. He needs Morty far more than Morty needs him. And that need is the one thing Rick has never been able to control, contain, or eliminate, no matter how hard he tries. Section 9. Rick and Morty's Codependency. Love disguised as exploitation. On paper, Rick and Morty's relationship looks terrible. An elderly alcoholic scientist drags his 14-year-old grandson out of school on a regular basis to go on life-threatening adventures across the multiverse. The boy misses classes, gets traumatized, witnesses things no child should ever see, and is constantly told that his intelligence is limited and his contributions don't matter. Rick uses Morty. He puts him in danger. He belittles him. He treats him like a sidekick at best and a tool at worst. If you described this relationship to someone who had never seen the show, they would say it was abusive. And honestly, on many levels, they wouldn't be wrong. But the show refuses to let that be the whole story. Because underneath the exploitation, underneath the insults and the danger and the manipulation, there is something real between Rick and Morty. Something that Rick has tried to deny, tried to suppress, tried to classify as a weakness, and ultimately failed to get rid of because it is woven so deeply into who he is that removing it would mean removing himself. The first thing to understand about why Rick keeps Morty around is the practical reason. Because Rick always has a practical reason for everything. In Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, the Season 1 episode that introduces the Council of Ricks, we learn that Morty's brainwaves serve a specific function. A Morty's brainwaves act as a kind of camouflage for a Rick's genius-level brainwaves. When a Rick is traveling with a Morty, it becomes much harder for enemies to detect and track the Rick. Morty is, in a very literal sense, a cloaking device. His average intelligence creates a field of normalcy that masks Rick's extraordinary intelligence from anyone who might be scanning for it. This is the explanation Rick would give if you asked him why he keeps Morty around. It's strategic. It's logical. It's a tool serving a purpose. And knowing Rick, he probably believes this explanation himself most of the time. It's much easier for him to think of Morty as a useful piece of equipment than to admit that he keeps a 14-year-old boy by his side because he loves him and is terrified of being alone. But the show gives us the real answer in that very same episode. When Rick is accused of murdering other Ricks across the multiverse, the Council of Ricks scans his memories to look for evidence. And during that scan, a single memory flashes on screen that changes everything. It's a memory of Rick holding baby Morty. He's cradling the infant, looking down at him with an expression that we almost never see on Rick's face. Tenderness. Pure, unguarded tenderness. A tear rolls down his cheek. Here's what makes this moment even more significant. This isn't Rick's biological grandson. Rick C-137's real daughter Beth was killed in the bomb that also killed Diane. The Morty that Rick is holding in that memory is from another dimension, the Prime dimension, where Rick eventually settled after giving up his search for Rick Prime. Rick looked at a baby who was not technically his grandchild, a baby who belonged to a version of Beth who was not technically his daughter. And he felt something so powerful that it registered as one of the most emotionally significant memories in his entire life. That's not strategy. That's not brainwave camouflage. That's love. The show continues to reveal the depth of Rick's attachment to Morty through moments that Rick can't fully control. In A Wrinkle in Time, the Season 2 premiere, Rick and Morty find themselves in a situation where they're both falling through a void between dimensions. There is one device, a time-stabilizing collar that can save one of them. One collar, two people. Someone is going to die. And Rick, without hesitation, without calculation, without any of his usual weighing of options and angles, gives the collar to Morty. He fastens it on his grandson and lets himself fall. He chooses to die so that Morty can live. Now, Rick does end up surviving because of circumstances that play out in the episode. But that's not the point. The point is the moment of choice. In the split second where Rick believed one of them had to die, he didn't choose himself. The man who has spent his entire life since Diane's death building systems to guarantee his own survival. The man who constructed a section of the multiverse specifically to ensure his dominance. The man who treats self-preservation as practically a religion. That man gave away his only lifeline to save a boy he's known for about a year. That tells you everything about where Morty really sits in Rick's heart, regardless of what Rick says out loud. Then there's the Rick Shank Rickdemption, the Season 3 premiere. In that episode, Rick is locked in a Galactic Federation prison. The Federation is trying to extract the secret of interdimensional travel from his brain. From the outside, it looks like Rick got himself captured and is in serious trouble. But as the episode unfolds, we learn that Rick turned himself in on purpose. His entire imprisonment was a plan. He let himself get captured so he could access the Federation's computer systems from the inside and destroy their entire economy. But why did Rick need to destroy the Federation? Why did he go through all of that trouble? The answer is his family. The Federation had occupied Earth. The Smith family was living under alien rule. Rick's imprisonment was the price he paid to free them. He sat in a prison cell, allowed his brain to be probed, and executed one of the most complex plans of his life, all to protect the people he claims not to care about. When he shows up at the Smith house after the Federation collapses, he plays it cool. He acts like it was all about some petty personal agenda. But the result speaks for itself. His family is free. Earth is free, and Rick is the one who made it happen. The show also explores what Rick is like without Morty, and the picture isn't pretty. Whenever Rick is separated from Morty for extended periods, he deteriorates. His drinking gets worse, his behavior becomes more reckless, his already thin connection to anything resembling emotional stability gets even thinner. Morty functions as a kind of anchor for Rick. Not because Morty controls him or calms him down, but because Morty's presence gives Rick something to protect. And having something to protect, even if he'd never admit it, is the closest thing Rick has to a reason to keep going. This is what rest and Rick-laxation showed us so clearly. When Rick was split into his clean and toxic halves, his love for Morty ended up in the toxic pile, because Rick considers that attachment to be a vulnerability. But the episode also showed us that without that attachment, Rick becomes hollow. Clean Rick was functional, polite, and efficient, but he lacked the emotional core that makes Rick who he is. The love Rick feels for Morty might be something he classifies as toxic, but it's also the thing that keeps him tethered to reality. Without it, he'd just be a very intelligent machine with no reason to exist. Morty's side of this relationship is equally complicated. Morty is not a passive victim in this dynamic. He gets something from Rick too, even if it comes at a high cost. Rick gives Morty a sense of purpose and importance that he doesn't get anywhere else in his life. At school, Morty is unremarkable. His grades are poor, his social life is limited, and he's constantly anxious. But with Rick, Morty matters. He's needed. He goes on adventures that most people can't even dream of. He sees things that no other human being has ever seen. And yes, those adventures are dangerous and traumatizing, but they also make Morty feel like his life has meaning, beyond just being an average kid with average problems in an average town. This is the codependency at the heart of the show. Rick needs Morty to have something worth protecting, someone who makes him feel connected to humanity. Morty needs Rick to feel special, to feel like he's part of something bigger than himself. Each of them fills a hole in the other, but neither of them fills it in a healthy way. Rick's version of love involves dragging a child into danger and then occasionally showing tenderness when he thinks nobody is watching. Morty's version of importance involves being a human shield for a man who openly tells him he's not very smart. They both get something they desperately need from each other, but the way they get it is damaging to both of them. The show is honest about this. It doesn't pretend that Rick and Morty's relationship is purely heartwarming or purely toxic. It's both. Every beautiful moment between them exists alongside something harmful. Rick saves Morty's life and then insults him. Rick gives up his survival collar and then drags Morty into another nightmare the following week. Rick holds baby Morty with tears in his eyes and then uses Morty's brainwaves as camouflage without a second thought. The love and the exploitation aren't separate tracks running in parallel. They're the same track, twisted together so tightly that you can't pull them apart without destroying both. There's a moment in Something Wicked This Way Comes that captures this perfectly. The devil, operating as a shopkeeper named Mr. Needful, gives Summer a pair of shoes or some other cursed item that ends up hurting her. When Rick finds out that Summer has been harmed, he doesn't go after the devil with technology or science or some elaborate scheme. He hits the gym, gets physically strong, and then he and Summer literally beat the devil up in a parking lot. It's absurd, it's hilarious, and it's also genuinely touching because it shows that when someone hurts a member of Rick's family, his response isn't calculated or strategic. It's visceral. It's protective. It's the response of someone who cares deeply, even if his normal behavior would never suggest it. These are the cracks in Rick's armor, and they always involve his family. No matter how thick the walls get, no matter how many layers of sarcasm and nihilism and alcohol he piles on top of his emotions, the love keeps finding its way through. It comes out in split-second decisions during emergencies. It comes out in memories that flash on screen during brain scans. It comes out in the way Rick treats threats to Morty versus threats to himself. He'll take enormous risks with his own life and barely blink. But the moment Morty is in real danger, something shifts in Rick. The calculation stops. The detachment drops. And for a brief, raw moment, you see the man underneath. The man who lost Diane, who lost his Beth, and who is holding on to this Morty with everything he has because he cannot survive losing someone again. That's the tragedy of Rick and Morty's relationship. It is, at its core, a love story between a broken man and a boy who doesn't fully understand how broken his grandfather is. Rick loves Morty in the only way he knows how, which is badly, imperfectly, dangerously. And Morty accepts that love because it's the most extraordinary thing in his otherwise ordinary life, even though it costs him more than a 14-year-old should ever have to pay. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But Rick's inability to love people properly doesn't just affect Morty. It echoes through the entire family, especially through the person who has been dealing with Rick's broken version of love for the longest. his daughter Beth, who spent 20 years waiting for a father who abandoned her and has spent every moment since his return trying to earn the approval of a man who can barely look at himself in the mirror, let alone give someone else what they need. Section 10. The Absent Father. Rick's relationship with Beth and its generational damage. Rick Sanchez abandoned his daughter for approximately 20 years. That's not speculation. That's not a fan theory. That's a fact that the show establishes in its very first season and never walks back. Rick left. He walked out of Beth's life when she was a child, and he didn't come back until she was a grown woman with a husband, 2 kids, and a house in the suburbs. 20 years of birthdays, school events, scraped knees, first days, last days, heartbreaks, milestones. Rick missed all of it. And when he finally did show up, he moved into the garage like he just stepped out for groceries. Now, we know from the show's backstory that Rick C-137's original Beth was killed alongside Diane by the bomb that Rick Prime sent through the portal. The Beth that Rick lives with during the series is not his biological daughter. She's the Beth from Rick Prime's dimension, the one that Rick Prime abandoned when he left his family 20 years before the show begins. Rick C-137 eventually gave up his search for Rick Prime and landed in this dimension, stepping into the empty space that Rick Prime had left behind. So the Beth we see on the show grew up without any version of her father for 2 decades, and the Rick who came back isn't even the one who left. But Beth doesn't know any of this for most of the series. As far as she's concerned, her father left when she was young and came back when she was an adult. And the emotional damage from that absence runs deep. It shapes everything about who Beth is, how she parents, how she handles her marriage, and how she relates to Rick now that he's back. The most obvious way this damage shows up is in Beth's desperate need for Rick's approval. Beth worships her father. She defends him constantly, makes excuses for his behavior, and bends over backward to accommodate his lifestyle, no matter how disruptive or dangerous it is. When Jerry raises legitimate concerns about Rick's influence on the family, and Jerry does raise legitimate concerns, even if he does it in the most annoying way possible, Beth almost always takes Rick's side. She dismisses Jerry's worries. She frames Rick's recklessness as genius, that Jerry is too simple to understand. She treats any criticism of Rick as an attack on her own identity, because she has built so much of who she is around being Rick Sanchez's daughter. Dr. Wong saw this dynamic clearly in Pickle Rick. During the therapy session, when Beth is talking about how Rick couldn't make it because he's so important and so brilliant, Dr. Wong makes a quiet observation. She says that Beth admires Rick, and she says it in a tone that makes it clear this isn't a compliment. Because what Beth admires about Rick, his independence, his self-sufficiency, his refusal to need anyone, those aren't virtues, they're symptoms. Rick's emotional unavailability isn't strength. It's damage. But Beth has been starved of her father's presence for so long that when he finally came back, she was willing to accept whatever version of him showed up and call it good enough. This is something that happens in real families all the time. When a parent is absent, the child often builds an idealized version of that parent in their mind. They imagine reasons for the absence. They tell themselves stories about why the parent left. And when the parent returns, the child is so invested in the fantasy version that they can't see the real person clearly. Beth does this with Rick constantly. She sees his cruelty as directness. She sees his alcoholism as eccentricity. She sees his emotional distance as independence. She has reframed every single one of his flaws as a feature, because admitting that her father is deeply broken would mean admitting that the man she waited 20 years for isn't the man she imagined. Rick knows Beth feels this way, and while he doesn't deliberately exploit it in the way a true manipulator would, he doesn't correct it either. He lets Beth believe what she wants to believe because it's convenient for him. Her worship gives him a permanent place in the household. Her defense of him keeps Jerry from ever gaining enough ground to push him out. Her willingness to overlook his behavior means he never has to change. Rick benefits from Beth's idealization of him, even if he didn't consciously create it. But there are moments where Rick's genuine feelings for Beth break through, and those moments are complicated. In the Rick Redemption, when Rick dismantles the Federation and comes home, he indirectly encourages Beth to stand up for herself, which leads to her separating from Jerry. On the surface, this looks like Rick undermining Beth's marriage for his own benefit, and to some extent it is. But there's also a reading where Rick, in his twisted way, is trying to free Beth from a relationship he considers beneath her. He sees Beth as brilliant, capable, and held back by a man who doesn't deserve her. The problem is that Rick's idea of helping Beth is just as controlling and damaging as his idea of helping anyone else. Then there's the ABCs of Beth, where the show digs into Beth's childhood in a way that's genuinely disturbing. We learn that when Beth was a little girl, Rick built her a fantasy world called Fruppyland. On the surface, Fruppyland seems like a sweet, magical place a father created for his daughter. But as the episode unfolds, it becomes clear that Fruppyland was essentially a padded room. Rick didn't build it purely out of love. He built it because young Beth was showing signs of being dangerously intelligent and potentially violent, traits she inherited from him. She was asking Rick to build her things like weaponized toys that could harm other children. Rather than address this behavior, rather than parent his child and teach her right from wrong, Rick built her a pocket dimension where she couldn't hurt anyone and left her to it. He solved a parenting problem with engineering instead of actual parenting. This pattern, Rick using science and technology as a substitute for emotional engagement, is the core of his failure as a father. He can build Beth an entire world, but he can't sit down and have an honest conversation with her. He can give her access to infinite dimensions, but he can't give her the one thing she actually needs, which is a father who shows up consistently and treats her like she matters more than his next adventure. The most devastating example of Rick's failure with Beth comes in the Season 4 finale, Star Mort Rick Turn of the Jerry. In this episode, it's revealed that Rick cloned Beth at some point in the past. He created an exact copy of his daughter and gave one of them the option to stay with the family, while the other went out into space to live a life of adventure. This version became known as Space Beth. But here's the crucial detail. Rick erased both Beth's memories of the decision. Neither Beth knows which one is the original and which one is the clone. And Rick claims that he doesn't know either, because he deliberately avoided finding out. On one level, you could argue that Rick did this to give Beth genuine freedom of choice, without being burdened by the knowledge of which version is, quote, real. But on another level, and this is the level the show leans into, it's an act of cowardice. Rick couldn't handle the emotional weight of the situation. He couldn't look his daughter in the eye and make a decision together. He couldn't be present for one of the most important moments of her life. So he did what he always does. He used science to avoid an emotional problem, erased the evidence, and walked away. Both Beths are left living with the uncertainty of not knowing if they're the original, and Rick gets to avoid the discomfort of having to engage with either of them on a truly honest level. The damage Rick has done to Beth cascades directly downward into how Beth parents Summer and Morty. Beth is not a bad mother, but she's a distracted one. She's so focused on managing her relationship with Rick, on earning his approval, on defending his place in the household, that her actual children sometimes get lost in the shuffle. Summer and Morty's problems, the huffing, the wetting pants in class, the anxiety, the acting out, all of these are at least partly the result of living in a household that revolves around Rick's chaos. And Beth, rather than addressing these issues head-on, tends to minimize them, the same way she minimizes Rick's flaws. She learned from Rick that acknowledging problems is weakness, and she's passing that lesson down to her own children. This is what generational damage looks like. Rick couldn't process his grief after losing Diane, so he abandoned Beth. Beth grew up without a father, developed an unhealthy attachment to the idealized version of him she built in her head, and now struggles to be fully present for her own kids because she's still chasing her father's approval. Summer acts out because she sees the family dysfunction clearly, but nobody listens to her. Morty gets dragged into Rick's adventures because the family structure is so warped around Rick that a 14-year-old being pulled out of school by his drunk grandfather is considered normal. The pain started with Diane's death, moved through Rick's abandonment, settled into Beth's identity, and is now spreading into the next generation. Rick sees this happening. He's smart enough to see the patterns. In his quieter moments, you can tell he understands that his presence in the Smith household is both the best thing and the worst thing that's happened to this family. He gives them adventure, excitement, protection from threats they'd never survive on their own. But he also gives them instability, danger, emotional whiplash, and the constant pressure of living with someone whose personal crisis is large enough to swallow everyone around him. The question the show keeps circling back to is whether Rick can break this cycle. Whether a man who was broken by loss, who coped by abandoning his daughter, who returned only to repeat the same patterns of emotional absence in a different form, whether that man can learn to be a real father and a real grandfather before the damage becomes permanent. Beth is already shaped by his absence. The question now is whether Summer and Morty will be shaped by his presence in ways that are just as harmful. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And for most of the series, the answer seems to be yes, the damage will continue, because Rick shows no real interest in changing. He goes to therapy under duress. He expresses love only in emergencies. He keeps drinking, keeps adventuring, keeps treating his family as supporting characters in a story that's really about him. But then something happens that Rick didn't plan for. Something that forces him to confront the emptiness at the center of his life in a way that he can't avoid or outsmart. After decades of chasing revenge, after building his entire identity around the goal of killing the man who murdered Diane, Rick finally catches Rick Prime. He finally gets what he wanted. And what comes after that victory turns out to be the most dangerous thing Rick has ever faced. Because for the first time in his life, he has nothing left to run toward. Which means he has no choice but to stand still and face everything he's been running from. Section 11. Revenge, Purpose, and the Void. After Rick Prime's death, for decades, Rick Sanchez had one reason to keep going. One goal. One mission that sat at the center of everything he did, every dimension he visited, every version of himself he encountered. Find Rick Prime. The Rick who murdered Diane and Beth. The Rick who sent a bomb through a portal and destroyed Rick's entire life in a single moment. The Rick who then went even further and used the Omega device to erase every version of Diane from every dimension across the entire multiverse, making sure that Rick could never find her again, anywhere, in any reality, ever. That quest for revenge was the engine that drove Rick C-137 for longer than most people have been alive. It's what made him build his own portal gun. It's what sent him tearing across the multiverse, killing other Ricks who got in his way. It's what eventually led to the creation of the Citadel. It's what brought him to the Prime Dimension in the first place, where he settled into a replacement family and started going on adventures with a Morty who wasn't technically his grandson. Every single major event in Rick's life before the show begins can be traced back to one thing: the burning, relentless need to find and kill Rick Prime. And here's the thing about revenge that the show understands on a deep level. Revenge isn't just about hurting the person who hurt you. It's about having something to aim at. It's about structure. When your life has been shattered by something as catastrophic as what happened to Rick, the grief and the rage are so enormous that they could swallow you whole if you don't point them somewhere. Rick pointed his somewhere. He pointed them at Rick Prime. And as long as Rick Prime was alive, as long as Rick hadn't found him yet, as long as the mission was still incomplete, Rick had a reason to wake up every morning. He had a reason to keep building, keep fighting, keep surviving. The revenge gave his life shape. It was ugly, violent, obsessive shape, but it was shape nonetheless. And sometimes, for someone drowning in grief, any structure is better than none. The show takes its time revealing the full scope of what Rick Prime did. In The Rick Shank Rickdemption, we get the first glimpse of the bomb that killed Diane and Beth, though Rick insists the memory is fabricated. In Rick Mirai Jack, the Season 5 finale, the truth of Rick's backstory is confirmed through evil Morty's actions. In Solarix, the Season 6 premiere, Rick accidentally resets all portal travelers and ends up back in Dimension C-137, where he encounters the AI version of Diane he built to haunt himself. And it's in that episode that the hunt for Rick Prime restarts in earnest, with Rick learning that if he was reset to his home dimension, Rick Prime was likely reset to his. But the full, devastating truth doesn't land until Unmortrican, Season 7, Episode 5. This is the episode where everything Rick has been working toward for decades finally happens. And it's also the episode where the show asks a question that Rick has been avoiding for his entire life. What happens when the revenge is over? The episode brings together an unlikely team. Rick C-137 and Evil Morty, two characters who have very different reasons for wanting to find Rick Prime, temporarily join forces to track him down. Evil Morty has his own agenda. He wants the plans for the Omega device, the weapon Rick Prime used to erase Diane from every reality. Rick wants one thing and one thing only. He wants Rick Prime dead. They find Rick Prime in his lair, and what follows is one of the most intense sequences in the entire series. Rick Prime has set up elaborate traps throughout his base, including rooms full of death matches that he designed to kill grieving Ricks who came looking for revenge. He built Saw-style challenges where Ricks were forced to fight each other to the death under the false promise that the last Rick standing would have his Diane restored. It was a lie. The surviving Rick would just face a final trap, a killbot wearing Diane's face and speaking with her voice. Rick Prime turned the grief of an infinite number of Ricks into a game for his own entertainment. Rick C-137, Morty, and Evil Morty fight their way through these traps. They eventually reach Rick Prime himself, and a brutal fight breaks out. Rick Prime is powerful. He's the first Rick to ever invent interdimensional travel, and he's had decades to prepare for exactly this kind of confrontation. He dominates the fight at first, overpowering both Rick and Evil Morty. At one point, a giant robot built in Diane's image crushes both Ricks. Rick Prime even tries to kill a Morty he believes is his own original grandson, showing that whatever twisted attachment he might have once had to his family means nothing compared to his desire to win. But Evil Morty is smarter than Rick Prime expected. He tricks Prime by switching appearances with the real Morty, putting his eye patch on Morty and Morty's shirt on himself. When Rick Prime goes to kill what he thinks is the real Morty, it's actually Evil Morty, who hits him with a hidden weapon that stuns him. Evil Morty then downloads the plans for the Omega device from Rick Prime's systems, strips him of his regenerative abilities, and shuts down his remaining body doubles. Then Evil Morty does something that defines his character perfectly. He gives Rick Prime to Rick C-137. Not as a gift, as a dismissal. Evil Morty got what he came for. Rick Prime is no longer useful to him. So he leaves Rick C-137 alone with the man who destroyed his life. And then, Rick kills him. After decades of searching, after killing countless other Ricks, after building the Citadel, after constructing the central finite curve, after abandoning his search and settling into a replacement family, after all of it, Rick Sanchez finally stands over the man who murdered Diane and Beth, and he beats him to death with his bare hands. Rick Prime doesn't go quietly. Even as he's dying, he mocks Rick. He tells Rick that by killing him, Rick has become just like him. He taunts him about Evil Morty escaping with the Omega device plans. He tries to get under Rick's skin one last time to make sure that even in death, he leaves a wound. And Rick doesn't care. He doesn't stop. He doesn't listen. He just keeps hitting until Rick Prime stops moving. This should be the moment of triumph. This should be the scene where the audience cheers, where decades of pain are avenged, where Rick finally gets the closure he's been chasing since the day Diane died. But that's not what happens. The show doesn't play this moment as a victory, it plays it as an ending. And not the satisfying kind. Because immediately after killing Rick Prime, Rick falls into a depression. The show makes this explicit. With Rick Prime dead, Rick doesn't feel free. He doesn't feel healed. He doesn't feel like a weight has been lifted. He feels empty. The mission is over. The target is gone. The thing that gave his life direction for decades has been completed, and now there's nothing on the other side of it. No second act. No new purpose. No grand revelation that makes everything worth it. Just silence. This is something that happens to real people who organize their entire lives around a single goal, especially a goal rooted in grief or anger. As long as the goal exists, it serves as a distraction from the underlying pain. You don't have to deal with your grief if you're busy hunting for someone to punish for causing it. You don't have to sit with your loneliness if you're constantly moving, constantly planning, constantly focused on the next step in the mission. The revenge quest was Rick's most elaborate avoidance strategy. More effective than alcohol, more consuming than his masks, more all-encompassing than any adventure. It ate up decades of his life and gave him something to do with his rage besides turn it inward. And now, it's gone. Rick Prime is dead, and Rick is left with the one thing he's been avoiding since the day Diane died: himself, his grief, his guilt, his loneliness. All the feelings he's been outrunning, outsmarting, and outdrinking for the majority of his adult life. With Rick Prime gone, there's nothing standing between Rick and the full weight of his own emotional damage. The fortress he built around himself was always designed to keep two things out: threats from the outside and feelings from the inside. Rick Prime was the last external threat that mattered. With him gone, the only enemy left is the one Rick has never been able to defeat, which is what's happening inside his own head. The show handles this beautifully by not giving Rick a quick recovery. It doesn't have him bounce back the next episode with a new mission and a witty one-liner. It sits with the emptiness. It lets the audience feel the void that Rick is feeling. Because the point the show is making is important. Revenge doesn't heal you. It just delays the healing. And when the delay is over, the wound is still there, exactly as raw and exactly as painful as it was the day it was made. Decades of hunting didn't bring Diane back. Killing Rick Prime didn't undo the bomb. The satisfaction of vengeance lasted for seconds, and then it was gone. And all that was left was the same broken man who started the journey, just older and more tired. Rick Prime even understood this, which is part of what makes him such an effective villain. His final taunts weren't random cruelty. They were designed to make sure Rick knew that killing him wouldn't fix anything. Rick Prime wanted Rick to feel the emptiness. He wanted Rick to realize that the revenge was hollow, that all those decades were wasted, that Rick had become a mirror image of the man he was trying to destroy. Violent, detached, willing to sacrifice anything and anyone in pursuit of a goal that, ultimately, meant nothing. And the worst part is that Rick Prime was at least partially right. Not about everything. Rick is not the same as Rick Prime. Rick C-137 loves his family. Rick Prime abandoned his without a second thought. Rick C-137 feels guilt, feels pain, feels loss. Rick Prime felt nothing but amusement at other people's suffering. They're not the same person. But Rick Prime was right about one thing. Killing him didn't save Rick. It just removed the last thing Rick was hiding behind. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Season 7 episodes that follow on Mortrican show a Rick who is adrift. He's still going on adventures. He's still functioning. But there's a hollowness to it. The fire that drove him is gone. The anger that kept him sharp is dissipating. And what's left in its place is something Rick has spent his whole life trying to avoid. The need to find a new reason to live that isn't about revenge, isn't about control, isn't about proving he's the smartest, and isn't about running from the past. A reason that might actually require him to do the one thing he's resisted more than anything else in his entire existence. The boring, unglamorous, terrifying work of actually getting better. Section 12. Therapy actually works. Rick's slow, reluctant path toward healing. For most of Rick and Morty's run, Rick Sanchez has treated therapy the way most people treat a root canal, as something to be avoided at all costs, tolerated only when. Absolutely forced into it and forgotten about the moment you walk out the door. He turned himself into a pickle to skip a session. He told Dr. Wong that her entire profession was designed to make people comfortable, the way we make cattle comfortable. He booby-trapped her office with voice-activated weapons and escape routes. He once told his smart guns to whitelist humans during a fight at the therapy office, and then paused before adding, "the therapist," implying he doesn't even consider therapists to be fully human. Rick's contempt for therapy has been one of the most consistent character traits in the entire series. And yet, quietly, almost invisibly, something has been changing. Because despite everything Rick has said about therapy, despite every insult and every escape attempt and every dismissive comment, Rick keeps going back. And the person he keeps going back to is Dr. Helen Wong, the calm, perceptive, unshakable family therapist who first appeared in Pickle Rick and has slowly become one of the most important characters in Rick's life. Not because she can match his intelligence, but because she can see through. Dr. Wong's first encounter with Rick set the tone for their entire relationship. In Pickle Rick, she sat across from a man who had literally transformed his body into a different species to avoid being in her office. A man who was covered in rat blood and sewage and barely alive. And she didn't flinch. She didn't try to impress him. She didn't try to out-argue him. She listened to his rant about how therapy was beneath him. How he's a scientist who changes the world when he doesn't like it. How he's not a cow and doesn't need to be made comfortable. And then she calmly, precisely, and completely dismantled every word he said. She told him that the only connection between his intelligence and the sickness destroying his family is that everyone, including Rick, uses intelligence to justify sickness. She told him he alternates between viewing his mind as an unstoppable force and as an inescapable curse. She told him therapy isn't an adventure, it's just work. And some people would rather die than do the work. And Rick, for one of the very few times in the series, had absolutely nothing to say in response. But here's the important thing about that first session. Rick didn't learn anything from it. He walked out of Dr. Wong's office, got in the car with Beth, and went drinking. Summer and Morty asked to keep going to therapy, and their request was ignored. The episode ended with Rick exactly where he started, unchanged, unhealed, and unwilling to engage with the process that might actually help him. Dr. Wong gave him the truth, and he threw it away. The show could have left it there. It could have made Dr. Wong a one-episode character, a punchline, a brief moment of clarity that Rick promptly forgot about. But it didn't. Dr. Wong came back. In the Season 4 finale, Star Mort Rick Turn of the Jerry, we learned that the Smith family has been continuing to see Dr. Wong for therapy sessions. This is shown briefly, almost in passing, but it matters. The family kept going. And Rick, apparently, kept going with them. When the Galactic Federation attacks during one of their sessions, Rick actually says something interesting. He tells the attackers, "Tammy, this is the office where my family works to better itself." It's played for comedy, but the words themselves are significant. Rick calls Dr. Wong's office a place where his family works to get better. He might not include himself in that statement, but the fact that he's there, that he's present in the room, that he's showing up for sessions, that's movement. Small, stubborn, barely visible movement, but movement nonetheless. The real shift doesn't happen until Season 6. In Analyze Piss, something remarkable occurs. Rick goes to therapy voluntarily. Not because the family dragged him, not because a school counselor recommended it, not because he was forced into it as a condition of something else. Rick Sanchez, of his own free will, sits down with Dr. Wong and talks. He's dealing with a problem. A never-ending parade of small-time villains who keep attacking him because fighting Rick Sanchez has become a way for losers across the universe to try to make a name for themselves. It's annoying. It's exhausting. And for once, Rick decides to deal with it not by fighting back, but by stepping back. Dr. Wong's advice helps. Rick chooses not to engage with these petty challengers. He ignores them. He lets them bounce off him. For the first time in the series, Rick takes the therapeutic approach. He examines his own behavior, recognizes that his pattern of responding to every threat with overwhelming force is part of the problem, and chooses a different path. It's not dramatic, it's not flashy, there's no speech, no big emotional breakthrough, no tears. It's just Rick making a slightly better choice because someone helped him see a slightly better option. And that's what real therapeutic progress looks like. Not a single moment of transformation, but a slow, gradual series of slightly better choices. Then comes the encounter with Pissmaster. This is a pathetic, low-level villain who shows up to fight Rick, fails miserably, and ends up being beaten up by Jerry, of all people. Rick, following his new approach, doesn't engage. He lets it go. But later, he overhears people at a bar talking about how pathetic Pissmaster is, and something unexpected happens. Rick feels bad for the guy. Not in a strategic way, not in a way that serves his interests. He genuinely empathizes with the person he has every reason to dismiss. He sees something in Pissmaster's desperation and failure that resonates with something inside himself. Rick goes to share a six-pack with Pissmaster. He shows up at the villain's door with beer, intending to just sit with the guy and maybe make him feel a little less alone. But when he gets there, Pissmaster has taken his own life. He's gone. Rick arrives too late. And what Rick does next is one of the most genuinely kind things he's ever done in the entire series. Out of pure sympathy, not strategy, not self-interest, not manipulation, Rick assumes Pissmaster's identity. He puts on the costume, stages a series of events, and makes it look like Pissmaster died heroically saving people. Rick turns a man who died in despair into a man who is remembered as a hero. He does this for no personal gain. He does this because he knows what it feels like to be in that much pain, and he wanted to give this stranger something that nobody was able to give him: dignity in his worst moment. That's not the Rick from Season 1. That's not even the Rick from Season 3. That's a man who has been changed, slowly and imperfectly, by the process of engaging with his own emotional life instead of running from it. Dr. Wong didn't fix Rick. She doesn't claim to, but she gave him tools, and for the first time, he's actually using some of them. The progression continues into Season 7. In Air Force Wong, the very first scene of the episode shows Rick in therapy with Dr. Wong. Not forced, not tricked, not under duress, just sitting in a chair talking to his therapist. When the President of the United States calls and interrupts the session asking for Rick's help, Rick tells the President not to stigmatize mental health. The President responds with, "Therapy's working." And the thing is, the President is right. Therapy is working. Air Force Wong goes even further by bringing Rick's relationship with Unity back into the picture. Unity, the hive mind ex who left Rick back in autoerotic assimilation, the breakup that led to Rick's suicide attempt, returns in this episode. Unity has been trying to check up on Rick, calling him, reaching out, worried about him because they heard he'd started hunting for Rick Prime again. Rick ignored every attempt at contact. So Unity does something extreme. They take over the entire state of Virginia to get Rick's attention. When Rick, Dr. Wong, and the President investigate, it becomes a situation that requires Rick to actually talk to Unity about their relationship and what went wrong. And Dr. Wong is there to mediate. She essentially conducts a couples therapy session between Rick and a hive mind, which is exactly as absurd and exactly as emotionally real as it sounds. Dr. Wong tells Rick directly that when Unity was worried about him, his response was hostile enough to cause a huge problem. She tells Unity that Rick is changing, slowly, but he is changing, and that the reason Rick brought her along is because he doesn't know how to show Unity that change on his own. Think about what that means. Rick Sanchez voluntarily brought his therapist to help him navigate a difficult emotional conversation with someone he cares about. The man who turned himself into a pickle to avoid therapy is now bringing his therapist along as backup for situations he knows he can't handle alone. That is enormous growth. It's not perfect growth, it's not complete growth, but it's real. The episode ends with Rick and Unity's situation resolved, but not fully repaired. Unity helps save the day, and Rick invites them back to the house, wanting to reconnect. But Unity sets a healthy boundary and leaves. And Rick accepts it. He doesn't spiral. He doesn't go to the garage and build a death ray. He doesn't drink himself into oblivion. He takes the rejection, processes it, and moves on. Later in the episode, he shows up at the President's door with a six-pack, the same gesture he tried to make with Pissmaster, suggesting that Rick is slowly learning how to reach out to people in small, human ways rather than through grand gestures or manipulative schemes. The Season 7 finale, Fear No Mort, takes Rick's emotional journey even further. In this episode, Morty enters something called a fear hole, and during the experience, he and Rick encounter a version of Diane, not the real Diane, but a Diane from a reality where she survived the bombing because her version of Rick sacrificed himself to save her. This encounter forces Rick to face the ghost of his wife in a way he hasn't had to since he built that AI version of her to haunt himself. It's painful, it's raw, and it's another step in Rick's long, slow process of learning to sit with his grief instead of running from it. And that's really the message of Rick's entire psychological arc across the series. The smartest man in the universe, the man who can solve literally any problem, the man who built a partition around infinity to guarantee his own supremacy. That man still has to do the same boring, difficult, unglamorous work that every other person on Earth has to do when it comes to healing from trauma. There's no shortcut. There's no invention that fixes a broken heart. There's no portal that leads to a dimension where you never got hurt. There's just the work. The sessions with Dr. Wong, the slightly better choices, the moments of reaching out instead of pushing away, the slow, painful, imperfect process of becoming a slightly less broken version of yourself. Rick Sanchez is not healed. He may never be fully healed. The damage runs too deep, the losses are too enormous, and the patterns are too deeply carved into who he is. But he's moving. For the first time in decades, the smartest man in the universe is doing the one thing his intelligence could never do for him. He's letting someone help. And in a show about infinite dimensions, infinite possibilities, and infinite versions of every person who ever lived, that small human act of accepting help might be the most extraordinary thing Rick Sanchez has ever done. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.